The man didn't even look at her. That was the thing Eliza Whitmore would remember long after everything else blurred together. Not the cold, not the wind that cut through her wool coat like it had a grudge, not even the 5 children standing in a loose, frightened cluster on the platform. What she remembered was how Elias Rourke walked out of that station door and turned away from her without a single glance, his shoulders rigid, his jaw set, fury radiating off him like heat from a coal stove. He had just shoved past the station master with enough force to make the older man stumble, and whatever words he'd spoken inside were still hanging in the frozen air when the door banged shut behind him. He walked to the far end of the platform and stood there with his back to the world. To her, if you had arrived 900 miles from everything you knew, one suitcase, one ticket, one name on a piece of paper, and the man who was supposed to meet you couldn't be bothered to face you, what would you do? That question sat inside Eliza's chest like a stone in cold water. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the end, because what happens next will shake you. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from, and let me see how far this story has traveled. The train had arrived 12 minutes late, which was actually something of a miracle given the weather. Eliza had spent the last 40 minutes of the journey pressed against the window, watching the Wyoming landscape turn from pale brown flatness into something harder and more serious mountains shouldering up through the clouds, snowfields that went on until they blurred into sky, the occasional dark stand of pines that looked less like trees and more like warnings. She had not slept well in 3 days. She was 31 years old, which by Ohio standards, or at least by the standards of the particular corner of Ohio she came from, meant she had already missed whatever window people believed you were supposed to climb through. Her mother had said as much, with the particular gentleness that sharp observations sometimes wear. Her sister had said it less gently. The women at the dress shop where she'd worked for 14 years had said it in the specific way women say things they've agreed not to say, in careful silence, in averted eyes, in the way a conversation shifted when she entered a room. She wasn't bitter about it, or she'd spent enough years talking herself out of bitterness that the difference had become unclear. The advertisement in the Ohio Plainsman had been small 4 lines, tucked between a notice about a land sale and a listing for a missing mule. Rancher, widower, Wyoming Territory, seeks capable woman of good character. 5 children. Correspondence welcome. She'd clipped it out with her sewing scissors and put it in her apron pocket and carried it around for 11 days before she wrote the first letter. Correspondence that followed had surprised her. Not the letters themselves. She'd expected to receive something practical and a little formal, an inventory of expectations, but the warmth of them. The rancher had written about his children with a specificity that felt genuine. Willa's stubbornness, Mabel's sweet tooth, Jonah's silences, Henry's questions that arrived at a pace no adult could fully answer, little Samuel's habit of falling asleep wherever he happened to be sitting. He'd written about the land with a kind of plain affection, the way a person writes about something they have fought hard for. And there had been moments of unexpected honesty, a passage about how some nights the house felt so empty that he couldn't hear himself think over the silence. She had written back with equal honesty. She'd told him about the dress shop, about the counting she did to make herself useful to people who needed her without quite seeing her, about the smallness of her life that she'd tried not to resent. Over 4 months, 112 pages had moved between them across more than 900 miles. She had believed with the particular thoroughness that cautious people apply to decisions they've finally allowed themselves to make, that she knew this man. She stepped off the train into 32 degrees of Wyoming wind and looked for him. What she found instead was a stranger's anger. Station master had barely gotten her name out, Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore, before she heard the voice. Came from inside the station, low and controlled in the way that voices get when a man is working very hard not to shout. She couldn't make out the words through the door, but she could make out the shape of them, the hard consonants, the clipped rhythm that meant something had gone very wrong. Then the door opened and Elias Rourke came through it. She'd seen the photograph he'd sent, a formal thing, taken in town, a man in his Sunday clothes trying to look like something a photograph could contain. The man who walked out of that station was nothing like the photograph. He was broader, rougher, the kind of weathered that didn't come from age, but from years of work done in all weather without asking for exceptions. His coat was good quality but old. His boots were caked with trail mud that had dried and been dried again. His face was the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for too long and had run out of patience for anything that added to the weight. He looked at the station master. He said something short and sharp that she caught only the edge of "I'll deal with it at home." And then he walked past both of them and pushed through the far door to the platform. He never looked at Eliza, not once. She stood in the sudden quiet, her suitcase in her hand, the wind finding the gap between her collar and her hat, and she tried to organize what she was feeling into something manageable. Tired. She was cold. She had come 900 miles and spent 4 months writing letters and given notice at her job and said goodbye to people she wouldn't see again. For she had told herself this part quickly, probably a very long time. She had built something in her mind out of those letters. She could feel it listing now, the way a structure goes when the foundation shifts. She walked to the far door and pushed through it. 5 children stood on the platform. They ranged from perhaps 4 years old to maybe 15 or 16. She adjusted the estimate when the oldest one turned, because there was something in the girl's face that was older than 15. Not hardened, exactly. More like a face that had been asked to hold more weight than faces that age usually hold, and had done it and showed the evidence. The others were behind her in a loose cluster, a girl of about 9 with a smear of something on her chin and eyes that were currently aimed at the middle distance in the way of children pretending not to listen. A boy of 11 or 12, standing slightly apart, his arms crossed at an angle that was either cold or defensive or both. A smaller boy 7, maybe 8, watching her with the direct, uncomplicated attention that children haven't yet learned to disguise. And the youngest 4 years old at most, clutching the back of the oldest girl's coat with both fists and staring at Eliza from behind that shelter with enormous dark eyes. The man Elias was at the far end of the platform. His back was still turned. The oldest girl looked at Eliza for a long moment. Then she took a breath that Eliza could see even from 10 feet away, the kind of breath you take before something you've been dreading. She walked over. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes," Eliza said. The girl was taller than she'd realized. She had her father's coloring dark hair, brown eyes, but her mother's bone structure, or what Eliza imagined her mother's bone structure might have been, fine. A little angular, kind of face that would be striking once she was through with growing into it. She was holding herself very carefully, the way people hold themselves when they're not certain of their footing. "My name is Willa," the girl said. "These are my brothers and sisters." She didn't gesture at them. She was looking at Eliza with the focused attention of someone who knows they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. "Mabel, Jonah, Henry, and that's Samuel. He won't let go of me until he decides whether to be scared of you or not." "That seems reasonable," Eliza said. Something shifted in Willa's expression, not a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. Then it went away. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I need to tell you something before we go any further." What Willa told her took 4 minutes. Eliza knew this because she counted, mechanically, the way she'd learned to count when her mind needed something to hold on to while the rest of it processed. 1, 2, 3. Willa spoke carefully without rushing, her voice steady in a way that cost her something. You could see it cost her something. The letters had not come from Elias Rourke. Elias Rourke didn't know they existed until this morning, when a wire from the station master arrived at the ranch telling him his mail-order bride was coming in on the noon train. Willa had written every single letter for 4 months. She had found an advertisement in a newspaper. Her father used to wrap things in the barn. She had written the first letter on her own, late at night, by lamplight, with her younger brothers and sister asleep in the other room. She had signed her father's name. When the responses came, addressed to Elias Rourke, she had intercepted them. She had read Eliza's words and written answers in a voice she had assembled from her father's old letters to her mother, letters Willa had found in a box under the bed and read 100 times. She had borrowed his cadence, his specific kind of directness, his habit of noticing small things and writing them down. She had done this for 4 months. She had done it because their mother had been dead for 2 years, and their father had stopped being present even when he was in the room. Because the pantry was getting empty in a way that was starting to mean something. Because Jonah had started getting into fights at school and couldn't say why. Because Mabel had stopped laughing. Because Samuel woke up screaming twice a week and Willa was the one who went to him. Because their father didn't hear it or heard it and couldn't move. Because Willa was 15 years old and she had been carrying a household on her back for 24 months and she had done everything she could think of and it wasn't enough. "I know you have every reason to leave," Willa said. Her voice was still steady. She had clearly rehearsed this part. "I know we did something dishonest. I know you came all this way thinking." She stopped, swallowed. "I know what you thought you were coming to. I'm sorry it wasn't true." Eliza looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the other children. Mabel still examining the middle distance with excessive concentration. Jonah, arms crossed, jaw tight, not looking at anyone. Henry, watching with that clear, unguarded attention. Samuel, still gripping Willa's coat, his dark eyes moving between his sister and this stranger. Then she looked at the man at the end of the platform, still standing with his back to all of it. "How old are you?" she asked Willa. 15. "And you did this yourself?" Henry helped address some of the envelopes. He didn't know what they were for. Eliza looked at Henry, who was now watching her with the expression of a child who has just realized this conversation is also about him. "Told me they were for a contest," Henry said earnestly. Something moved through Eliza's chest. Not quite laughter, not quite grief, not quite tenderness. Some mixture of all three that didn't have a name. "I see," she said. She looked again at Elias Rourke's back. The wind had picked up. She could feel it at her ankles, at her wrists, working its way through the inadequate wool of her traveling coat. Sky was the particular flat white of a Wyoming winter that doesn't discuss what it's planning. The train had already gone, she registered. There would not be another one until tomorrow morning at earliest. She had one suitcase, $43 in cash, and no return ticket. She walked to the end of the platform. She had to get within 10 feet of him before she was willing to announce herself, because she had enough respect for the situation to not want to startle him. She stopped and said evenly, "Mr. Rourke." He turned. She had the brief irrational thought that the photograph had actually failed him in both directions. It had made him look more composed than he was, but also somehow less present. As Elias Rourke in person had a quality that photographs couldn't replicate, which was the impression of a man who took up exactly the space he occupied and not 1 inch more, and who had learned to use that quality to keep people at a comfortable distance. His eyes were dark brown, and they were currently carrying a combination of mortification and anger and something else, something she identified, after a moment, as desperation, the specific variety that had been running long enough to look like stone. He looked at her. Then he looked past her at his children, who were watching from the middle of the platform with the collective expression of people waiting for a verdict. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected from his letters, or from what she'd assumed his letters would have sounded like, before she knew he hadn't written them. I can't," he stopped, started again. "This isn't something I had any part in. I want you to know that." "Your daughter explained," Eliza said. "She had no right." "She didn't have a lot of options," Eliza said. She kept her voice neutral, not soft, not combative. Just level. "From what I can tell, that landed." She watched it land. Something flickered through his expression that wasn't quite anger anymore. "I'll pay for your ticket back," he said, "to wherever you came from." I don't need you to pay for anything," she said. "I need somewhere to sleep tonight because it's 32 degrees, and the next train is tomorrow morning. That's all I'm asking for." He stared at her. "One night," she said, "and then I'll figure out the rest." The wagon ride to the ranch took just under an hour, and for most of it nobody spoke. Eliza sat in the front beside Elias, because there was no other room. The children had arranged themselves in the wagon bed, with the efficiency of people who have spent years sharing space. Samuel wedged between Jonah and Mabel, Henry sitting cross-legged at the back with his legs dangling, watching the landscape go by. Willa sat at the far end of the wagon bed and did not look at anyone. The road, such as it was, wound through terrain that alternated between open flatlands and abrupt rocky cuts where the land had made its opinion of travel known. The horse, a dark bay gelding that moved with the particular plodding confidence of a very experienced animal, didn't seem bothered by any of it. Elias drove with the ease of long practice, the reins loose in his hands, his attention moving between the road and the horizon, with the periodic alertness of a man who has learned to watch for things. After 20 minutes, Henry said, "Miss Whitmore, do you like sunflowers?" Elias said, "Henry, it's a reasonable question," Henry said reasonably. "It's all right," Eliza said. She looked back at him. "Sunflowers. We had some last summer," Henry said. "Papa said they're too much trouble, but I think he just forgot to plant them. You could help me plant some in the spring if you're still here. They grow good on the south side of the barn." "Henry," Elias said again, but with less force this time. "I'll keep it in mind," Eliza said. She felt Elias look at her sideways. She didn't return it. The ranch appeared around a long curve in the road, and Eliza understood, within the first 30 seconds of seeing it, why a 15-year-old girl had written 112 pages of desperate letters to a stranger in Ohio. The land itself was something. Even in December, even under snow, you could see the bones of it, the way it sat in the valley between two long ridges, the creek that cut along the eastern edge, the dark line of pines that acted as a windbreak on the north. There were cattle in the far field, Hereford crosses by the look of them, their red sides moving against the white of the snow. The fencing she could see from here was in good repair. Careful repair, the kind done by someone who knew what they were doing and had made it a priority. The house was another matter. It wasn't falling down. She needed to be clear with herself about that, because there was a distinction between deteriorating and fallen, and this house was still on the right side of that line. But it was on the wrong side of a lot of other lines. 2 windows on the south side had been stuffed with rags where the glass had broken. Porch railing had lost 4 or 5 of its posts and hadn't had them replaced. Paint she could tell there had been paint once, was gone from most of the eastern wall. The wood gone gray and then grayer in the way of wood that has given up expecting to be maintained. One section of roof over the lean-to addition had a sag in it that she made a mental note to look at more carefully in the daylight. She noticed that Elias watched her take it in, and she noticed that he watched her the way a person watches for judgment. Kept her expression neutral. She was not judging him. She was measuring. The inside of the house told a story that the outside had only suggested. The kitchen was functional and nothing else a cast-iron stove that worked. She could tell from the heat. A table with 6 chairs that didn't match. Shelves that held considerably less food than they were designed for. The floor had been swept recently. The dishes were washed. These were the marks of Willa's labor. Eliza understood the maintenance of basic order in a space that had been, at some point in the past 2 years, abandoned to entropy and then partially recovered. There was a parlor that seemed to be mostly being used for storage. A narrow hallway with 4 doors, and through the back window she could see the woodpile, which was lower than it should have been, by at least a factor of 2 for this time of year. Mabel, who had apparently decided the situation called for action, said, "I can make coffee." "I'd appreciate that," Eliza said. "I'm not very good at it," Mabel said, with the particular honesty of a 9-year-old. "It comes out wrong sometimes. Then we'll work on it together," Eliza said. She set her suitcase by the wall near the door. Not unpacking it, she was not going to presume, and took off her coat and hung it on the peg nearest the door and rolled up her sleeves. Behind her, she heard Elias say something quietly to Willa that she couldn't make out. She didn't try. She went to the stove and checked what was there and found very little. She found more in the cellar, not enough, but something to work with, and she worked with what she had. By the time the sun had started dropping toward the ridgeline, there was a proper supper on the table, nothing fancy, a thick stew built from the end of a ham bone and some dried beans and 3 carrots that had started going soft, biscuits that she and Mabel made together, with Mabel measuring wrong twice and Eliza adjusting without comment, a pot of coffee that came out better than Mabel's usual attempts, though she didn't say so in a way that made it a comparison. The children sat down at the table without being asked, which told her something about Willa's efforts. Elias sat down last, and then seemed faintly surprised to find himself sitting down for a meal that someone else had cooked, in a house that smelled like food and warmth, and something he hadn't smelled in long enough that he couldn't immediately name it. Normalcy, maybe, the faint edge of it. Nobody said much. Henry asked her 4 more questions between spoonfuls, ranging from whether she had any brothers, one older, to whether she had ever seen a mountain lion. She had not. But had she known, she would have made something up, because the look on his face when he asked was pure and uncomplicated delight. Samuel ate with the serious concentration of a very young child, confronted with a meal better than expected. Mabel ate 2 biscuits and looked like she wanted a third. Jonah ate without looking up, which Eliza noted and filed away. Elias didn't say anything for most of the meal. Then, when the bowls were nearly empty, he said quietly, "This is good." He didn't look at her when he said it. He was addressing his bowl. "Thank you, you're welcome," Eliza said. She slept in the room that had been cleared for her, which was a small room off the back hallway that had been used, she thought, for storage, and had been hastily emptied. The mattress was thin and the quilt was adequate, and the wind found every gap in the exterior wall with the methodical persistence of Wyoming winters. She lay awake for a while. She thought about the letters. Not with anger, exactly, or she was trying not to. What she felt was more complicated than anger. She thought about Willa at her lamplight, reading responses from a stranger, and writing back in a voice borrowed from her dead mother's box of keepsakes, doing the arithmetic of desperation and deciding this was the solution that added up. She thought about a 15-year-old girl carrying a family that a grown man had put down. Thought about what it cost Willa to stand on that platform and say what she said, steadily, to a stranger's face, knowing every possible consequence. Eliza had grown up in a house where you did not inconvenience people, where you made yourself useful and quiet and small, where the currency of worth was not causing trouble. She had become very good at this. She had spent 31 years becoming good at it. She recognized something in Willa. something she'd spent years trying to disguise in herself. The next morning, she was up before anyone else. She had told herself this was because she woke early. This was true, but also not the whole truth. She was up before anyone else because she was measuring. She went through the pantry carefully, making a mental inventory. She checked the woodpile through the kitchen window and confirmed what she'd estimated the night before. She looked at the accounts. There was a ledger on the shelf that she opened with the instinct of someone who had spent 14 years managing the books for a dress shop, and what she found inside it made her stomach drop. Not in surprise, in recognition. This was a man who understood cattle and land and weather, and not much else about the running of a business. The numbers weren't falsified or careless, they were honest, in the way that numbers are honest when the person recording them doesn't fully understand what they're recording. There were debts she could see the shape of. There was a name she noticed, written in the margin, in several places, Voss. See Voss. She closed the ledger and stood for a moment with her hand on its cover. Then she heard the creak of the floorboard in the hallway, and turned to find Elias in the doorway, dressed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She wasn't going to apologize for looking at the ledger. She'd thought about it for a moment and decided she wasn't. "I was checking the inventory," she said. He looked at the ledger under her hand. His jaw went a little tighter. "That's private," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I apologize, but I'd like to talk to you about it." "You're leaving this morning," he said. "The stage goes at 9. She looked at him. He was not wrong, technically. She had said one night, "I'd like to talk to you about the ledger first," she said. "Then you can put me on the stage." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her in the way of a man accepting an unpleasant appointment. He gestured at the chair across the table she sat. "The name in the margins," she said. "See Voss. Tell me about him." The expression that crossed his face then was the one she'd been waiting to understand. Not anger, not grief, but the specific and exhausted look of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot see the bottom of. "Voss is a lender," he said, "out of Cheyenne. I borrowed against the ranch 3 years ago. It was necessary, the herd was failing, and I needed to rebuild. The terms were what they were." He paused. "I've been keeping up with the payments." "You're 2 months behind," Eliza said. His eyes went sharp. "The ledger," she said, simply. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then that's being addressed how?" Another silence. "Spring calves," he said finally, "when I can sell." "Spring is 4 months away," Eliza said. She said it without inflection, not to be cruel, just because it was true and needed to be said plainly. "Voss has a clause here." She'd read it in the margin notes, the scratched summary of an agreement she hadn't seen but could reconstruct a clause that lets him call the full debt if payments fall more than 60 days behind. Elias didn't answer. He was looking at the ledger. "You've got about 3 weeks before you hit 60 days, Eliza said. He said nothing. Outside, the first gray light of morning was coming over the ridge. She heard, from somewhere in the house, the sound of a small child moving in bed, the soft noise of someone waking and deciding not to get up yet. Eliza sat with her hands folded on the table and waited. "How do you know any of this?" he said finally. The anger had gone out of his voice. What was left was something more complicated. "I kept the books for a dress shop for 14 years, she said. The owner was a good dressmaker and a poor businesswoman. I learned what failure looks like from the inside." He looked at her for a long moment. "Did the shop survive?" he said. "It did," she said, "eventually." He didn't ask what eventually had cost. She was grateful for that. "The stage goes at 9, he said again. But he said it differently this time. Less like a statement, more like a question he hadn't meant to ask. Eliza put both hands flat on the table and looked at the window where the morning was coming in. She thought about the pantry, the woodpile, the number in the margin of a ledger, the name C. Voss. She thought about Willa on the platform, steadying herself for a necessary honesty. Thought about Henry asking if she liked sunflowers. She thought about the sound of a child waking in a house where she didn't belong and had been told clearly that she was expected to leave. "Tell me about Voss," she said. "Tell me everything." Stove ticked. The morning light pushed further into the room. Elias Rourke looked at the woman sitting across from him, a woman he had not asked for, who had come 900 miles on the strength of his daughter's forgery, who had slept one night in his inadequate house and gotten up before dawn and read his ledger, and was now asking him to trust her with his worst problem. Took a slow breath, and then, with the reluctance of a man who has run out of alternatives, he started to talk. Elias talked for a long time. Not easily. He was not a man who talked easily about things that mattered. He talked the way a person moves across ice, with care, testing each step before committing weight to it. But he talked, and Eliza listened with the particular quality of attention she'd developed over 14 years of listening to a woman who ran a dress shop explain her financial decisions. which was the quality of attention that didn't interrupt and didn't react and didn't give the person speaking any reason to stop. Calvin Voss had come to him in the spring of 1881, when the herd had been hit by a respiratory sickness that moved through the valley fast and killed a third of his breeding stock before anyone understood what it was. The timing could not have been worse. His wife, Clara, had been dead 8 months, and Elias had been functioning in the specific way of a man who has decided that function is the only thing available to him. He had the children to feed. He had a ranch to hold together. He did not have time for the kind of grief that takes you apart slowly, so he had packed it somewhere. He didn't have to look at it, and he had kept moving. Voss had been recommended by 2 other ranchers in the valley, which was enough of a reference at the time. He was out of Cheyenne, well-dressed, had the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being trusted. The terms of the loan had seemed manageable, said this with the flat tone of a man who now understood that seemed manageable was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The interest rate was not unusual for a private lender in the territory. The clause about 60-day default was written in the kind of legal language that requires a particular kind of reading to fully understand what it means. Elias had not done that kind of reading. You had other things to think about, Eliza said. He looked at her as though she'd said something he hadn't expected. I should have read it better, he said. Yes, she agreed. She didn't. And here we are, so let's talk about where we are. He wasn't used to that either. She could tell the refusal to spend time on blame when there was more useful work to do. He was used to guilt working a certain way, as a long, slow wait. She didn't have time for guilt right now, and she could see that confused him. Pulled the ledger back across the table and opened it to the page she'd been looking at when he found her. Show me what you sold last season, she said. Everything. He showed her. It took another 40 minutes, and by the end of it the picture was clear enough, though not in the way she'd been hoping. The ranch was not failing the way a careless ranch fails. Elias Rourke knew cattle. His breeding decisions were sound, better than sound actually. He'd been quietly building toward a herd quality that would have been worth real money in another 2 or 3 years if the debt had given him time. His maintenance of the land and the fences was methodical. He had not wasted money on anything she could identify. What he had not done was watch the numbers closely enough to catch the small errors that accumulated into large ones and overpayment on winter feed that he hadn't noticed for 3 months. Contract for beef that had a price locked in at last year's lower rate when the market had moved. 2 calves he'd sold through the wrong buyer and lost 15% margin without realizing it. None of these was catastrophic alone. Together, they had the slow and certain effect of water finding a crack. You're not bad at this, she said finally. He looked at her. The ranch, she said, the cattle, the land, you're not bad at it. You're bad at the accounting side, and that's a different skill. I know what I'm bad at, he said with an edge. Good, she said. Then we're working from the same information. The children had started waking up. She could hear them through the walls, the particular morning sounds of a household that had developed its own rhythms. Henry's voice, asking something in the directional way of someone who has just woken up and immediately has questions. Mabel's quieter reply, the thump of someone's feet on the floor. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt and stopped when he saw Eliza still there. He looked at her. Then he looked at his father. Then he crossed the kitchen with the unself-conscious directness of a 4-year-old who has made a decision, climbed into his father's lap without asking, and put his thumb in his mouth. Elias's hand came up and settled on Samuel's back, automatically, the way hands move when they've done something so many times it's stopped being a gesture and become a reflex. Eliza looked at that for a moment and then looked back at the ledger. You need to talk to Voss before he comes to you, she said. I know, and you need something to offer him. A payment plan he can't easily refuse without looking unreasonable. Something on paper with specific terms. I know that too, he said. Do you have anyone who can help you put that together? The silence was its own answer. She said carefully, I could help you put it together. He looked at her over Samuel's head. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read, not refusal, not acceptance, something in between. You said you were leaving, he said. The stage goes at 9, she said. I know. It's 7:30 now. They looked at each other across the table, with the child asleep in his father's lap between them. One more day, Eliza said, and you'd have something on paper. Something that gives you a fighting chance. She missed the 9 o'clock stage. She told herself this was a practical decision, which it was. She was also aware that practical decisions are sometimes the clothing that other decisions wear when they don't want to be examined, and she set that awareness aside. The day was punishing in the particular way of Wyoming December, not actively storming, just cold with the flat. colorless cold of a sky that had nothing else to offer, the wind coming off the high ground and finding everything. Elias went out to the cattle in the morning and came back at noon with frozen ears and a report that the water trough in the east field needed breaking up again. Willa made lunch without being asked, without fuss, with the grim efficiency of someone for whom cooking has become a survival task rather than anything resembling pleasure. Eliza noted this and said nothing about it yet. After lunch, she spent 3 hours with the ledger and a piece of paper and the stub of a pencil that was the best she could find in the house. She built a repayment proposal from what was available, the spring calf sale, a projection on beef prices she could only estimate without a market report, the elimination of 2 costs she'd identified that could be cut without affecting the herd. It wasn't a comfortable proposal. It didn't make the numbers behave in ways they didn't want to behave. But it was honest and it was specific, and those were the 2 things that tended to matter in a negotiation. Mabel sat with her for part of the afternoon, not doing anything in particular, just sitting, in the way that a child sits near someone they're deciding about. Eliza let her sit. After a while, Mabel said, "Are you good at math?" "Pretty good," Eliza said. "Willa taught me my multiplication tables," Mabel said. "She's better at it than the school teacher." "Willa seems capable of a lot of things," Eliza said. "She worries a lot," Mabel said. "At night mostly. Can hear her sometimes." Eliza kept her eyes on the paper. "What does it sound like?" Mabel thought about this with the seriousness a 9-year-old brings to a serious question. Like when you're carrying something and it's really heavy and you can't put it down. You make that kind of breathing. She demonstrated. A soft, controlled exhalation. That. Eliza wrote a number on the paper. Her handwriting was very neat from years of keeping books. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Elias looked at the proposal she'd put together that evening. He read it twice, carefully, and she didn't interrupt him either time. He had a habit she was starting to recognize, of going very still when he was thinking hard, the way some people go still as opposed to the way some people move not rigid. Just quiet, all his attention turned inward. "This is good," he said finally. "It's a starting position," she said. "Voss will push back on the timeline. You'll need to hold on the interest rate. It's the thing that matters most in the long run." "I know how to hold a position," he said. She believed him. He did not look like a man who had trouble holding positions. He looked like a man who held them sometimes past the point of sense, and she thought that was its own kind of problem. But one thing at a time. "When can you get to Cheyenne?" she asked. 3 days, he said. 4 if the road's bad. You've got 3 weeks before the 60-day mark. That's manageable, as long as nothing goes wrong. He looked up at her. "Things go wrong," he said. "Yes," she said. "They do." She did not leave the next morning either. She didn't announce this. She simply got up before dawn again and started breakfast, and when Elias came through the kitchen, he looked at her at the stove and looked at the stage schedule, pinned to the wall beside the door, and did not say anything. She had not fully decided to stay. She was aware of this. She was also aware that not deciding to leave had become, functionally, the same as deciding to stay, and that she was using the ambiguity as a kind of shelter she wouldn't be able to live in indefinitely. The pantry needed doing. The woodpile needed doing. The window in the south wall had rags in it, and she'd found glass in the lean-to shed, enough to do one of the 2 panes. She fixed the window pane in the afternoon, which required borrowing tools from the shed, and learning how the existing frame was constructed, and doing the job twice, because the first time she'd measured wrong. Jonah came out while she was doing the second attempt, and watched her from 10 feet away without saying anything. He was 11, and he had the quality of a child who had decided that the world required careful study before engagement. She had recognized this quality because she had been a child like that herself. She didn't try to talk to him. She just worked, and he watched, and after a while he said, "You need someone to hold the other side of that." "I do," she said. He came over and held the other side. They fitted the glass in without dropping it, which Eliza counted as a genuine victory. "You've done this before," he said. "Never," she said. Thought it through very carefully. He considered this for a moment. "That works?" "Sometimes," she said. "Other times you measure wrong and do it twice." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Then he went back inside. That night Eliza lay awake again and listened to the house. She heard the wind working at the corners the way it had every night. She heard Samuel make a sound in his sleep, not crying, just a small noise, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. She heard from Willa's room that breathing Mabel had described. Soft, controlled, the breathing of someone moving a weight they can't set down. She thought about what she was doing here. She had come 900 miles on the strength of letters that didn't exist or that existed, but had been written by a 15-year-old girl pretending to be her father and the fact that she'd found them convincing said something she wasn't sure she wanted to examine too closely about what she'd wanted to believe. She was sleeping in a house that belonged to a man who hadn't asked for her, in a room that had been used for storing broken things. She had missed 2 stages and fixed 1 window pane and was partway through a repayment proposal for a debt that had nothing to do with her. She should leave. She knew she should leave. She also knew that Mabel had eaten dinner that night with the specific happiness of a child who has been learning something. They'd made the biscuits together again. Better this time, Mabel's measuring more careful. That Jonah had come to the table and sat beside her without being asked, which Willa had noticed with a flicker of surprise she hadn't bothered to hide. That Henry had presented her, at dinner, with a very detailed and largely accurate account of the migratory patterns of a bird she'd never heard of, which he'd apparently been saving for a moment when he had her full attention. That Samuel had fallen asleep in his chair before the meal was over and tipped sideways against her arm, and she had sat very still so as not to wake him. That Elias, washing dishes in a silence that was becoming incrementally less hostile, had said, without turning around, the biscuits were good. She had said Mabel made them, and he had looked back at his daughter with an expression that was, she was not reading it wrong. She was certain the expression of a man who has noticed something he has been too buried to see, and the noticing has cost him something. She was not leaving yet. She didn't know what she was instead. She was not leaving yet. The next week moved the way weeks move when there is real work to do, not quickly, but with the particular purposefulness of time that is being used rather than endured. She took inventory of the full pantry properly and made a list of what was needed and organized what was there by priority. She found that Elias had been buying some things at higher prices than necessary because he bought in Rawlins when there was a trading post 12 miles closer that carried most of the same goods. She didn't point this out as a criticism. She asked, casually, whether anyone had looked at the trading post prices recently, and Elias said he hadn't been that direction in a while, and she said she could check them if he needed, and he said there'd be occasion for that. She worked with Mabel in the kitchen every afternoon. Mabel was not a natural cook. She was imprecise, which in sewing would have been manageable, but in cooking produced variable results that ranged from adequate to puzzling. But she was willing, and willing covers a lot of gaps. By the end of the week, she could make a credible stew, and her biscuits were consistent, if not beautiful. She started sitting with Henry in the evenings when he wanted to talk, which was every evening. Henry's mind moved at a pace that reminded her of a creek after snowmelt rapid, a little chaotic, carrying everything it encountered. He talked about birds, and about something he'd read in a book about the properties of different types of soil, and about whether it was possible for a horse to get bored, and about what he thought was at the bottom of the canyon on the ranch's south edge. She answered what she could answer and admitted what she didn't know, and asked questions when she was genuinely curious, which turned out to be often. She hadn't expected that. The genuine curiosity, Jonah was harder, came to meals. He held things when she needed something held. He didn't resist her presence the way he'd been resisting it the first 2 days. But he kept a distance she understood was not personal. It was the distance of a child who has learned that people leave, and has started doing the leaving first, preemptively, before it can be done to him. She didn't push on that. She just made sure he always had somewhere at the table. Samuel stopped hiding behind Willa somewhere around day 4. He simply stopped, the way young children transition between states completely, without marking the moment. On day 5, he handed Eliza a carved wooden horse with a broken leg, without explanation, as though the context was obvious. She asked if he'd like her to fix it, and he nodded once and stood beside her, while she worked on the leg with some wire and a small piece of wood from the scrap pile. When she was done, he turned it over in his hands 3 times, and then walked away, and she counted that as something. Willa watched all of this with an attention she tried to make look casual, and was not good at making look casual. She helped. Consistently, Willa was always helping. It was the mode she'd been operating in for 2 years. But she kept a certain quality of reserve that Eliza understood was not hostility. It was guilt. Willa had done something that had consequences she couldn't fully calculate, and she was waiting to see all of them before she allowed herself to feel anything about the outcome. Eliza waited for the right moment and then made a different choice. It was the 6th evening. She found Willa in the kitchen after the others had gone to bed, washing the dishes she'd left in the pan, because Eliza and Mabel had done them earlier and Willa was doing the ones she'd used later. She was washing them with the focused attention of someone who is keeping busy, because stopping means thinking. Eliza came in, poured herself a cup of the coffee that was still on the back of the stove, and sat down at the table. "The letter you wrote first," she said, "the very first one." "What did you say?" Willa didn't stop washing, that he was a widower with 5 children who needed someone capable. "What made you decide capable was the right word?" "Pause then, because that's what we needed, not someone sweet. Someone capable." Eliza looked at her coffee. "How did you know the difference?" Willa was quiet for a moment. "Because sweet doesn't fix a woodpile," she said. "And we needed the woodpile fixed." Eliza said nothing for a moment. "You did something dishonest," she said finally. Willa's hands stilled in the wash water. "I know," she said. "It was also resourceful," Eliza said. "And brave. Those 2 things can be true at the same time. I'm not telling you that to excuse the dishonest part. I'm telling you because you need to know that I understand why you did it." Willa turned from the basin. Her face was doing several things at once. "Do you?" she said. Her voice was careful. "I know what it looks like when someone does the only thing left to do," Eliza said. "I've done a few things like that myself." Willa looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the dishes, but the set of her shoulders was different. Not all the way loose, but something had shifted. "Are you going to stay?" she said. Quiet, direct, not looking at Eliza. Eliza wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the truest answer she had. Elias left for Cheyenne on the 10th day. He'd asked her the night before, with the careful phrasing of a man asking something that costs him something, whether she'd be willing to remain at the ranch while he was gone. "For the children," he said, "in case anything came up." He made it clear, or tried to make it clear, that he was asking for a practical reason, not a personal one. Told him she'd stay. He left at first light, and the house felt different without him, not worse. Exactly, but differently shaped. More relaxed in some ways. The children moved differently when he was gone, with less awareness of an adult presence requiring management. Henry was louder. Mabel hummed while she worked. Even Jonah sat in the kitchen in the evenings instead of his room. She liked this version of the house too. She liked it in a way that complicated her thinking. She was useful here. That was the simple version of it. After 14 years of being useful in a way that nobody looked at directly, she was useful here in a way that had immediate visible effects. Pantry was better organized. The window didn't leak. Mabel could make biscuits. Samuel slept through 2 nights in a row, which Willa mentioned to her on the 3rd morning. With a look that said she understood, this was connected to something Eliza had done, though neither of them specified what. But she was also aware of a harder truth. Being useful is not the same as belonging. She'd been useful in Ohio for 31 years, and she had not belonged there. She could arrange herself into the shape of use indefinitely. That was not the same as a life. She thought about this in the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet. She sat by the stove and thought about it, and didn't come to conclusions, because she was honest enough with herself to know that the conclusion she was building toward required more information than she currently had. Elias came back on the 4th day, which was a day earlier than she'd expected. She heard the horse in the yard at dusk, and went to the window and saw him dismounting in the thin, cold light, and the way he moved told her something before he came through the door. Not quite right. Something had gone sideways. He came in, handed her his coat, because she reached for it, sat down at the kitchen table, and said, "Voss won't take the proposal." She sat down across from him. "He rejected all of it," she said. "He's calling the debt," Elias said, "the full amount, by the end of the month." He said this with the flatness of a man who has driven 4 days to deliver news he cannot change, and has used the drive to arrive at a place beyond the first response to it, past the anger and partway past the despair, and into something harder on the other side of both. He said the 60-day clause was clear. He said he had other interests in the valley that he needed to protect. Eliza thought about the way Voss's name appeared in the margins of the ledger, the frequency of it. "What other interests?" she said. Elias looked at her. "He wants the land," she said. It was not a question. It arrived in the room with the flat, specific weight of a thing that has been true for a while and has simply been waiting to be said. Elias looked at the table. "He's made offers before," he said. 3 of them. The last one was 8 months ago. "Turn them all down." He paused. "The offers were below market. A long way below. So the loan was never really about the interest," Eliza said. "I don't know that," he said. "I don't know what I can prove." "What would you need to save it?" she said. "If Voss won't negotiate, what would it take to just pay him off?" He said a number. It was a large number. Not impossible. She had been doing the arithmetic in her head since he'd said calling the debt, but large. It would require something she hadn't considered offering because she hadn't expected to need it. Something she had spent 14 years building, dollar by dollar, in a savings account at a bank in Columbus, accumulated from a wage that had never been generous and from the kind of careful, Relentless economy that people who are afraid of being without practice as a matter of survival. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The stove ticked. From somewhere in the house she could hear Mabel singing to herself in the particular tuneless way Mabel sang, which was not melodious but was consistent. "I have money," Eliza said. Elias looked up. She said the number. It was almost exactly what was needed. He stared at her. "No," he said. "Let me finish." "No," he said again with more force. "That's your money. You're not." He stopped. Started again. "You came here to, that's your money, Miss Whitmore. I'm not taking your savings. I'm not offering charity," she said. "I want to be very clear about that." She kept her voice level. "I'm offering a loan, with written terms. With a repayment schedule we negotiate together and put on paper, witnessed with specific conditions." She looked at him steadily. "A business arrangement, nothing else." He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully name, something between resistance and something that looked, beneath the resistance, like a man trying not to show how much he needed to be saved. "Why?" he said. It was the right question. She'd been waiting for it. "Because I'm good at numbers," she said, "and you're good at land. And the children deserve both those things working in the same direction." She paused. "And because Voss is trying to steal from you, and I have a strong objection to that." He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know when I could pay you back," he said. "That's what the written terms are for," she said. "We figure out what's realistic, and we write it down, and we both sign it. That's how it works." The silence between them had a different quality now. Not hostile, not comfortable exactly. Something in between that was its own thing. Specific to this kitchen, this stove light, this particular December. "Put all of that at risk," he said. "For a ranch you have no part in." "I have a part in it now," she said quietly. "Well, either of us planned it that way." He looked down at his hands on the table. Large hands, marked with work, the kind of hands that have done exactly the work they look like they've done. He was quiet for a long moment, and she let him be quiet, because she understood that this was a man being asked to accept help from a woman he hadn't asked for a property that represented everything he had, on terms he couldn't yet see the shape of. That required a certain amount of time. Finally, he said, "We'd put it all in writing." "Every word," she said, "and if I can't repay on schedule mines." "Then we renegotiate," she said, "together on paper." In advance, and nodded slowly once. Then he said, "All right," in the voice of a man who has made a decision that frightens him, and has made it anyway because the alternative is worse. She got up and went to the shelf, where she kept the ledger, and brought it back to the table with a clean piece of paper. "Let's start with what Voss needs by the end of the month," she said. And they began. They worked through the night. Not by design, neither of them had said, "Let's work through the night." It simply happened, the way certain necessary things happen. Without announcement, the work pulling them forward past the point where stopping made sense. The stove needed feeding twice. The coffee went cold and Eliza made a second pot, and it went cold too, and they drank it anyway. Some point past midnight, Elias got up and added wood to the stove, without breaking the conversation they were having about the spring calf projections. And Eliza noticed that he'd started doing that moving through the kitchen, without the careful deliberateness of a man in a space he's uncertain of. He moved like someone who had accepted that this was where he was. She noticed it and then went back to the numbers. The written agreement took 3 drafts. The first draft she wrote, and Elias read it and said 2 of the repayment terms were unrealistic, given how cattle sales actually worked in the territory. And he was right about that. She'd built the schedule on assumptions from Ohio commerce that didn't translate. The second draft incorporated his corrections, and she found a problem with the interest calculation she'd used, which was more conservative than it needed to be, and would have cost him an extra $60 over the repayment period for no reason. The third draft was right. They both read it twice, and then Elias read it a third time, in the specific way of someone making sure they haven't missed anything that will cost them later. "Fair," he said. "It's meant to be," she said. "To both of us. That's what fair means," she said. He looked up from the paper. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not softness exactly, but a kind of opening. The way a room feels different when a window is cracked after being shut too long. It was gone quickly, replaced by the more familiar set of his face, but she'd seen it. He signed the document. She signed it. She found 2 witnesses the next morning, the station master, who came out from Rawlins for other business, and Mrs. Alderman from the neighboring spread, who came by coincidentally to return a borrowed pot, and was persuaded with coffee and directness to sign her name to a piece of paper she read carefully before agreeing to. The agreement was real. It existed on paper, witnessed and signed, and whatever happened next, that part was done. What happened next was that Elias rode to Cheyenne a second time, and this time he came back in 2 days. He came back looking like a man who has put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time, not rested, because he hadn't rested, but with the particular quality of exhaustion that belongs to relief rather than defeat. He'd met with Voss, he'd settled the immediate debt, paid the full called amount, and received a written receipt that he handed to Eliza with the careful formality of someone returning something that belongs to someone else. "It's done," he said. She looked at the receipt. The numbers matched what they'd agreed on. "Put it in the ledger." "How did Voss take it?" she said. Elias set his hat on the peg. He wasn't happy, he said. He'd been planning on something to land. He didn't say that. He didn't have to, she said. Elias looked at her. No, he said, he didn't. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the coffee that Mabel had made that morning, which had improved to the point of being genuinely drinkable, and sat down. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the ride, the kind of tired that accumulates over years and occasionally surfaces all at once when something forces it up. "He'll try again," Elias said. "Voss. He's not done." "Probably," she said, "but you'll have more time now, and better records, and a clearer picture of where the money goes." He looked at the ledger on the shelf. "You found 4 separate errors last week that I'd been carrying for over a year. You were managing everything alone," she said. "Errors accumulate when you can't divide the work." "Clara used to help with the accounts," he said. It was the first time he'd said her name to Eliza. Just like that, dropped into a sentence about accounts, the way a name appears when someone forgets for a moment to be careful about it. Eliza said evenly, "She had a head for numbers?" "Better than mine," he said. He was looking at his coffee. "Better than most." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear Henry somewhere near the barn, talking to himself or the horse with Henry. It was sometimes hard to tell, and the particular silence of a frozen afternoon that had decided to stay that way. "The errors started in the fall of '81, Eliza said. "The ledger shows it." He understood what she was saying. Fall of 1881 was 6 months after Clara died. The accounts had started to slip in the same season he'd started to slip, and had been slipping quietly ever since. And he hadn't fully seen it because you can't see everything when you're surviving. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. "You kept the herd sound," she said, "in the land. Those are the things that were hardest to replace. And you kept them." He looked up at her. "You're being generous," he said. "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference." The victory of paying off Voss, and it was a victory. Whatever came after, the immediate crisis was over, changed the temperature of the ranch in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to miss. Elias started staying at the dinner table after meals. Not talking much. At first, he was still a man who talked in specific, purposeful increments rather than continuous streams, but present, in a way he hadn't been before. He answered Henry's questions instead of deflecting them. He asked Mabel about her baking, which was a small thing that was not a small thing, because Mabel had been baking into a silence for months, and the question arrived to her like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. One morning, Eliza came downstairs to find a mug of hot coffee sitting on the counter near the stove, clearly left for her, since there was no one else in the kitchen. She stood and looked at it for a moment. She drank it. She didn't say anything about it to Elias. He didn't mention it either. The next morning it was there again. She found herself noticing him in ways she applied careful management to. The way he explained something to Jonah about fence posts, crouching down to the boy's level with an ease that suggested it had once been natural to him and was becoming natural again. The way he looked at the cattle in the east field in the early light, not possessively, but with the specific attention of someone who has made a long commitment and is checking on it. The way he held Samuel without appearing to think about it, the child simply part of the arrangement of him, the way a tool is part of a practiced hand. She was managing these observations because she understood what they meant, and she understood that what they meant was a complication she had not planned for and should not allow to become a problem. She had come here as a practical solution to a practical problem, or that was what she told herself, revising the story of her own arrival into something more useful than the truth, which was that she'd come because 4 months of letters had made her believe in something she wanted badly enough to travel 900 miles for. She could not afford to believe in that too directly. Not yet, not here, not in a house where she slept in a room that had been used for storage, in a space that had been given to her provisionally, on terms that had never been fully negotiated. She occupied herself with the accounts. Now that the immediate crisis was resolved, she and Elias spent 2 evenings going through the full ledger from the beginning, not to find more errors, though they found some, but to build a proper picture of the ranch's actual position and potential. It was the kind of work Eliza had done instinctively for 14 years at the dress shop, and it had a particular satisfaction, the satisfaction of a thing coming clear, the numbers arranging themselves into meaning, the shape of a situation becoming visible once you had all its parts. What the numbers showed, once properly organized, was something Elias hadn't fully seen before. The ranch was not in bad shape. It was in the shape of something that had survived serious pressure and maintained its core value. The land was good. The herd was better than good. The debt, now cleared, had been the primary drain, and without it the operation had a genuine path forward. Not a comfortable path, not an easy one, but a real one. The spring calf sale at reasonable market prices would recover most of what had been spent. A second sale in the fall could establish a reserve. You could make a profit by the end of next year, Eliza said, on the second evening. A real one, not large, but real. Elias studied the figures she'd arranged on the paper. She'd drawn them out with column headers and clear row labels, the way she'd kept books at the shop. Something the dress shop owner had initially resisted and eventually conceded made the numbers legible in a way her own system hadn't. If nothing goes wrong, he said. Things will go wrong, she said. But this is the picture when things go normally wrong, as opposed to catastrophically wrong. Catastrophically wrong is what Voss was. He almost smiled at that. Almost. You have a particular way of organizing bad news, he said. I've had practice, she said. He looked at her across the table, and there was that opening again, the brief unguarded quality she'd seen the night they signed the agreement. This time it stayed a little longer. Where did you learn all of this, he said. Not the dress shop. Before that she considered the question. My father kept books for a mill, she said. He used to let me sit with him while he worked when I was young. He said I had a head for it. She paused. He died when I was 16, and I started keeping books for my mother's household. Then for the shop when the owner hired me at 17. You've been keeping other people's books your whole life, he said. Kept my own, she said. I just didn't have much to keep track of. He looked at the ledger. You will now, he said. She wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that. She didn't ask. It was Henry who noticed first, because Henry noticed everything and had not yet learned the social skills required to pretend otherwise. You look at Miss Whitmore funny sometimes. Henry told his father, at an entirely public moment breakfast, all 5 children present, Eliza at the stove with her back to the table, and therefore present for every word of it. The silence that followed had a very specific texture. Henry, Elias said. Not bad funny, Henry said, with the clarifying instinct of someone who has misjudged a social situation and is attempting repair. Like how you look at the east field in the morning. Like you're checking if it's still there. Another silence. Eliza kept her eyes on the pan she was stirring. She was stirring oats, and she was stirring them with great concentration. That's enough, Elias said. I'm just saying. Henry subsided, but Mabel was looking at her plate with the expression of a child working very hard not to smile, and even Jonah had lifted his eyes from his breakfast to look at something on the ceiling with sudden and total absorption. Willa, across the table, met Eliza's eyes for one brief moment when Eliza turned to bring the pot to the table. Willa looked away first, but not before Eliza saw something there, not quite hope, because Willa had learned to be careful with hope. Something more cautious than hope, but in the same direction. 2 weeks after Voss had been paid off, Elias asked Eliza if she would stay. Not in the way she'd expected. She'd been half expecting some version of a formal conversation, a practical discussion of terms. What happened instead was an ordinary evening. The children in bed, the house quiet, both of them at the kitchen table, with the ledger between them. For the 3rd time that week, and Elias set down his pencil and looked at the table for a moment, and then said, without preamble, I'd like you to stay on. Permanently, she looked up. As what? She said carefully. As he stopped, he picked up the pencil, put it down again. I don't know how to say this right. Say it wrong then, she said. I'll understand. He looked at her. Something in his face was fighting with something else in his face, and she recognized the fight because she'd seen it in her own mirror often enough, the war between what you want to acknowledge and what you've decided it's safer not to. You've done more in 6 weeks than I've managed in 2 years, he said. The house, the children, the accounts. He paused. Jonah laughs now. Samuel hasn't woken up screaming in over a week. Willa, he stopped again. Willa set down something she's been carrying since Clara died. I can see it in how she moves. Eliza said nothing. This isn't about what you've done for us, he said, and the frustration in his voice was the frustration of a man who is getting to something by the wrong road and knows it. That's not, he pressed his hand flat on the table. I'd like you to stay, because when you're not here, the house has a quality to it that I've been trying not to give a name to. Eliza kept her hand still on the table. What quality, she said. Like the East Field, he said, and then he caught himself, obviously hearing Henry's voice in his own words. and the expression that crossed his face was something between mortification and resignation. Like something I'm going to need to check on, he said. All the time, whether it's there, the stove ticked. A log settled. She thought about Ohio. She thought about 14 years in a dress shop and a savings account she'd been building towards something she hadn't been able to name. She thought about the weight she'd felt on that platform in the frozen wind, one suitcase in her hand, no guarantee of anything. She thought about the coffee that appeared on the counter every morning before she came downstairs. "Elias," she said, "what are you asking me?" He met her eyes. "Stay," he said, "as my wife, if you're willing." He looked away briefly. "I know it's not what you thought you were coming to. I know the first weeks were, I know I wasn't, you were grieving," she said. And ambushed. "Both," he said, "yes." He looked back at her. "That's not what you deserve," as an explanation. "You came 900 miles. You deserve better than a man who can't say the thing he means." She was quiet for a moment. The quiet had the quality of something that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at the place it was heading. "Say it then," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally decided to set it down in front of someone and see what they do with it. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I didn't want you to leave 2 days after you arrived, and I knew it, and I didn't know what to do with knowing it. I want you here. He stopped. "Then I want to see what this could be, if you're willing." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm willing." It was not a dramatic answer. It was not the kind of answer that appears in stories as a grand declaration. It was the answer of a woman who had made a careful and deliberate decision and knew it, the way she knew anything she'd thought through, completely, not with excitement, which passes, but with the particular settled quality of something true. What she did not know in that moment was that Elias Rourke had already done something she hadn't told her. He had done it before he asked her to stay. He had done it 2 days before, on a day when she'd taken the children into Rawlins for supplies, and he'd been alone at the ranch for the first time in weeks. He had sat in the kitchen with the accounts in front of him, and he had thought about all the things that could still go wrong, the things that went wrong with ranches, with land, with money, with people. The things that went wrong with love, specifically, which was a category of going wrong he had expertise in, because he had loved Clara with everything he had, and she had died anyway. And the portion of himself he'd put into that love had gone with her in a way he hadn't fully prepared for. He had thought about this for a long time. And then he had gone to Rawlins himself while Eliza and the children were on the other side of town at the trading post, and he had bought a train ticket. It was a ticket back to Columbus, Ohio, one way. He had put it in the inside pocket of his good coat, the one he wore to town. He had told himself he was holding it in reserve. He had told himself he was being practical, giving himself a way to do the right thing if it came to that. If he decided that asking her to stay was asking too much, that his life was too damaged and too far from what she deserved. He had told himself a lot of things. The ticket was still in the coat pocket on the evening he asked her to stay. And after she said, "I'm willing," and he sat across from her in the quiet kitchen with something in his chest that felt terrifyingly like relief. After that, he didn't throw the ticket away. He didn't take it out and look at it. He just left it where it was, and he told himself it didn't mean anything, that he'd held it as an option, and the option was no longer relevant. But he didn't destroy it. He left it in the pocket of the coat that hung on the peg beside the door, and there it stayed, small and folded in the dark. The next few weeks had a quality Eliza recognized from childhood, the quality of winter beginning to give ground even before it was visible. Cold was still serious. The snow still came. But something in the angle of the light had shifted by degrees, and you could feel the distant promise of a season that wasn't here yet. The house shifted too in ways that accumulated. She moved her suitcase out of the storage room not dramatically, simply because it was in the way, and unpacked it properly, which took about 15 minutes since she'd never had much. Put her things in the small dresser and hung her 2 spare dresses on the peg behind the door and set her mother's hand mirror on the windowsill where the morning light hit it. Mabel found the hand mirror 2 days later and asked to hold it, and Eliza let her, and they spent 10 minutes making increasingly exaggerated faces at their reflections until Mabel was laughing so hard she had to sit down, which was the most uncomplicated happiness Eliza had seen from any of them since she arrived. Jonah asked her one afternoon to show him how she'd done the accounting for the ledger. Not tell him, show him, which was a different request, and one she took seriously. She sat with him for an hour and went through the column system and the cross-referencing and the way you could catch errors by doing the addition 2 different ways and comparing. He was quick with numbers, quicker than she'd expected, with the specific quickness that comes from a mind that's been underused and is glad of exercise. "You're good at this," she told him. He shrugged in the way of boys who want to receive a compliment and haven't decided yet if it's safe. "It's just addition. It's pattern recognition," she said, "which is a different thing. Not everyone has it." He looked at the ledger page for a moment. "My mother used to do the accounts," he said. "I used to watch her." Eliza looked at him steadily. "Taught you well without knowing it," she said. He didn't answer, but he stayed at the table for another 30 minutes, going back through earlier pages and checking columns she hadn't asked him to check. It was Willa who found the ticket. She found it on a Wednesday, a week and a half after the evening Elias had asked Eliza to stay. She found it because she was looking for her father's good coat, to brush it, one of the 100 small maintenance tasks she'd absorbed into herself so thoroughly that she did them without being asked, without marking them as tasks, the way breathing gets absorbed, and she put her hand in the inside pocket and found the folded paper. She knew what train tickets looked like. She'd been the one to order the supplies for the household by mail, which meant she'd handled postal forms and shipping papers, and once, a ticket receipt. She unfolded it and read it, Columbus, Ohio, one way. She stood in the hallway with the coat over one arm and the ticket in her hand for a long time. Then she folded it back exactly as she'd found it, put it back in the pocket, and hung the coat back on the peg. She did not tell Eliza. She told herself she needed to think about it. She told herself she didn't fully understand what it meant when had he bought it. Why had he kept it? Had something changed since, or was it still what he intended? She was 15 years old, and she understood people better than most 15-year-olds. But even she could not be certain what the ticket meant without more information. So she watched. She watched her father in the evenings, the way he sat at the table now, the way his attention had a different direction to it than it had 6 weeks ago. She watched him leave coffee on the counter before dawn. She watched the small calibrations that happen between two people who have started to orient themselves toward each other without formally acknowledging it, the way he passed her the salt before she reached for it, the way she handed him the figures he needed before he asked, the way they'd started finishing each other's sentences in conversations about the ranch with the ease of people whose thinking has started to run in compatible channels. She watched all of this, and she thought about the ticket, and she came to a conclusion that frightened her. Father was falling in love with Eliza. She could see it, the way you can see a thing, clearly precisely because you've been watching for it. And it frightened him. It frightened him in the specific way that losing her mother had made everything frightening, the way that loving someone, once you've learned what losing them feels like, becomes its own kind of terror. And the ticket was his terror, made paper, an escape route he'd prepared before he'd let himself feel too much, so that when it became too much, he'd have a way to undo it without having to say that's what he was doing. He could hand Eliza the ticket and call it protection, call it doing the right thing, call it anything except what it was, which was a man preparing to destroy something good, because he was afraid of what would happen if he let himself keep it. Willa knew this because she was 15 and had been paying attention for 2 years, and also because it was exactly what she was afraid she would do herself, someday love something, and ruin it out of fear before anyone else could. She watched and she waited, and she hoped she was wrong. She was not wrong. 3 days after Willa found the ticket, Eliza found it herself. She found it because she was looking for a button that had come off Elias's good coat she'd offered to replace it, which had produced a brief negotiation in which Elias said she didn't have to do that, and Eliza said she was doing it anyway, because the button was right there in her sewing basket from where it had fallen. And Elias had accepted this with the expression of a man who has learned that certain arguments are not worth the energy they would require. She'd found the button. She'd gone to the coat for the measurement. She'd put her hand in the pocket to check for anything that might be in the way, and her fingers had found the folded paper, took it out and read it. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and sat down at the table with her sewing basket in front of her and the ticket on the tables beside it, and she took several careful breaths. She was not going to react to this immediately. She had learned through years of being a person that other people made decisions about, without fully consulting, that immediate reactions served the reactor more than they served the situation. She was going to sit with this information until she understood exactly what she was feeling and what, if anything, she intended to do about it. What she was feeling, once she'd sorted through it, was several distinct things. There was hurt, which was reasonable, and she acknowledged it. There was anger, which was also reasonable, and she also acknowledged it. And beneath both of those, there was something older and more familiar, the recognition she'd been carrying her whole life. The knowledge that the careful architecture she built around herself could be dismantled by someone else's decision in the time it took to hand her a piece of paper. She had been here before. Not here specifically, not in a Wyoming kitchen, with a Wyoming man's betrayal in her hands, but here in the essential sense, the sense of having worked hard and put herself into something, and then discovered that the other person had been quietly preparing to undo it. She sat with her sewing basket and the ticket, and the winter light coming through the repaired window pane, the window she'd fixed, the glass she'd measured and cut and set properly on the second try, and she made a decision about what to do next. She was going to wait for Elias to tell her. She was going to give him the chance to say it himself, to hand her the ticket himself, to have the decency to face her with what he'd done rather than having her confront him with evidence. She would give him that chance. She folded the ticket back along its creases and went and put it back in the coat pocket and returned to the kitchen and threaded her needle and sewed the button back onto the coat so well that you could not have told which button was the replacement. She hung the coat back on the peg. She waited. She did not wait long. 2 mornings later, Elias came into the kitchen while she was building the day's fire in the stove, and she knew from the way he came in with that particular deliberateness, careful step of a man who has decided something and is moving toward it before he can undecide that the time was now. Kept her hands on what she was doing. She did not make it easy for him by turning around. "Eliza," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I need to talk to you about something." She set the kindling in the stove and turned, and she looked at him, and she kept her face neutral with the practice of a woman who has kept her face neutral through a great many things. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the ticket and set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "I had it made 3 weeks ago," he said, "before I asked you to stay." "I know," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I found it," she said, "replacing your button. I put it back." Something moved through his expression, not surprise, exactly, but the look of a man who has prepared a speech and discovered the person he's giving it to already knows the ending. "Then you know what it is," he said. "It's a ticket back to Columbus," she said. "One way." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I thought I was being practical. Giving you a way out if Elias." Her voice was quiet and very clear. "You were giving yourself a way out." The silence sat between them. "You're not protecting me," she said. "You're protecting yourself." He didn't answer. He looked at the ticket on the table. "You're afraid," she said. "I understand that. I understand it more than you probably think I do. But buying this," she gestured at it without telling me, while asking me to stay, while letting me believe. She stopped herself. Let the breath out. "That's not something you did for me." Picked up the ticket, held it. She waited. "I am afraid," he said. Came out plainly, without the resistance she'd expected, and it hit her differently for that plainness. When Clara died, there are things that don't come back from that. I've been trying to," he stopped. "I didn't know I was going to feel this way. About you, I didn't plan it. Neither did I," she said. He looked at her. "But that's not an excuse," she said, "for making decisions about my life without telling me." "No," he said, "it's not." The kitchen was very quiet. Kindling she'd set had caught, and the stove was beginning to warm. Outside, the frozen world was doing what it did, holding still, holding cold, holding everything at the edge of something that might eventually become spring. "What are you going to do with it?" she said, nodding at the ticket. He looked at it in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at her. And then, without saying anything else, he crossed to the stove and opened the firebox door and put the ticket in. Caught fast. Paper does. He closed the firebox door and stood there with his hand on it. Eliza stood on the other side of the kitchen and watched the small curl of smoke work its way up through the stovepipe. "I'm sorry," he said. He didn't say it easily. It had the texture of something true. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had not asked for her, and had fallen in love with her anyway, and had panicked, and prepared an escape he didn't use, and who was now standing in his own kitchen with his hand on stove that was burning the evidence of his fear. "I know," she said. She turned back to the stove and finished building the fire. Stood where he was for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, and she heard the sound of him settling into his own kitchen in the morning, the particular sound of a man who has decided, without conditions this time, to stay. They did not speak again for several minutes. When Mabel came downstairs, she found both of them at their usual places, Elias at the table with his coffee, Eliza at the stove with breakfast going. Nothing to see, nothing that looked like anything had happened. But Willa, who came down behind Mabel and stood in the doorway reading the room with the precise attention she'd developed over 2 years of reading rooms because her life depended on it, saw something in the quality of the quiet between them that she hadn't seen before. Not peace, exactly. Something harder than peace and more earned. She went to her chair and sat down and said nothing, And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she didn't feel the need to listen for every sound in the house. The ticket burned, and the morning went on, and nobody talked about it. That was the Rourke way. Eliza had come to understand not avoidance exactly, but a kind of practical forward motion that treated resolved things as resolved and didn't dig them back up for examination. Elias went out to the cattle after breakfast. The younger children went about their morning. Willa washed the dishes with the careful attention she brought to everything, and Eliza dried them beside her, and neither of them spoke about what Willa had seen in the kitchen that morning, or what she'd understood from it, or what it meant that the quality of her father's silence at breakfast had been different from any silence Eliza had heard from him before. They didn't speak about it because they didn't need to. Some understandings pass between people without language, particularly between women who have both been paying close attention to the same man for different reasons and have arrived, through separate routes, at the same conclusions. The morning was ordinary. That was the strange part, how ordinary it was. The day after the ticket burned, and the day after Elias had said, "I'm sorry," with the full weight of meaning it, and Eliza had accepted it with the full weight of knowing what it cost him. The stove needed wood. The water needed hauling from the pump. Henry had questions about the migratory behavior of elk that required immediate attention. These things didn't pause for private reckonings. Eliza let the ordinariness carry her. She had learned, in 31 years, that ordinariness is not the enemy of meaning. It's usually the medium it travels through. What changed was subtle at first, and then less subtle. Elias, in the weeks following, began to include her in decisions that had previously been made alone, not grandly, not with announcement, simply by turning to her when a question came up and saying, "What do you think?" with the naturalness of someone who has gotten used to asking. Question about the spring breeding schedule. A question about whether to repair the lean-to roof before the next hard snow, or wait for better weather. Question about Jonah's schooling, which had become inconsistent because the road to the schoolhouse was genuinely dangerous in deep winter, and Elias hadn't known how to weigh the education against the risk. She gave her opinion on the lean-to-roof repair it now. She said, because a bad snowfall would make the repair cost 3 times what it costs today. And on Jonah's, she said what she thought, which was that Jonah was not getting enough challenge in the classroom, and that the inconsistency was less harmful than it appeared, because Jonah was educating himself through the ledger work and through the books in the house, and that what he needed more than regular school attendance was someone to tell him his mind was worth developing. Elias listened to all of this with the specific quality of attention she'd come to recognize as his not passive, not reactive, but genuinely processing, taking it in, and turning it and setting it against what he already knew. "Thought about him a lot," he said, "about Jonah." "I think about all of them," she said. He looked at her in the way he had lately, the way that was becoming familiar, that she'd stopped trying to interpret as anything other than what it was. "I know," he said. They repaired the lean-to-roof on a cold, bright Saturday, Elias on the ladder and Eliza handing up materials and keeping the nails sorted, which was not glamorous work, but was necessary work, and by midday it was done well enough to hold through the worst of what February could send. Elias came down the ladder and looked at it and said, "That'll do," which was, she had learned, his version of "that's excellent." She said, "The south section will need redoing in the spring." "I know," he said. "I could help with that too," she said. "If I'm here." He turned and looked at her directly, the slightly startled look of a man who's heard something sideways in a sentence. "You'll be here," he said. "I wasn't certain you knew that," she said. "Beat. Then I know that," he said, with a conviction that was also a kind of apology for the ways he'd previously made her uncertain of it. She turned back to gathering the leftover nails from the ground. He stood where he was a moment longer, and then he reached down and helped her with the nails, and they worked side by side in the cold, bright air without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. It was in this period of cautious, incremental building that Voss came back. He didn't come to the ranch. He was smarter than that. A direct confrontation at the property would have a certain clarity that didn't serve him. Instead, he came to Rawlins, and he came in the specific way of men who operate through structure rather than force, quietly, with paperwork, with the particular patience of someone who has decided to accomplish a thing and is comfortable taking the longer route. Elias heard about it from the station master, who heard about it from the bank clerk, who had seen Vosnai's name on a document that passed through the bank's office in connection with the land survey, not the Rourke land specifically, but the adjacent parcel to the north that had been held by an aging rancher named Prentice for 30 years. Prentice had been having his own trouble lately, of the kind that follows a bad winter and a hip that wouldn't heal right after a fall. He's buying up around you, Eliza said, when Elias told her. That's what it looks like. If he gets the Prentice land, he controls the northern water access to your east field. Elias's expression said he'd already understood this. Creek runs through Prentice's north corner. If Voss owns that corner, he can make your water rights complicated, she said. Even if he can't take them legally, he can make them expensive. Disputes, surveys, legal challenges. He doesn't need to take your land. He needs to make keeping it not worth the effort. The silence in the kitchen had the weight of something neither of them had wanted to say aloud. What do we do? Elias said. The we was not something he'd used before. Not with her. She heard it and didn't mark it openly, but she heard it. We get proper legal documentation of the water rights, she said. And we find out if Prentice would consider a different offer before Voss finalizes anything. I don't have money to buy Prentice's land. You don't need to buy all of it, she said. Just the northeast corner with the creek access. An easement properly filed. It would cost a fraction of the full parcel. He looked at her. You know a lot about property law for a seamstress, he said. The dress shop owner had a dispute with her neighbor over a shared wall for 7 years, Eliza said. I read everything that came through the office. Something in his face moved not quite a smile, but the territory around one. I'll ride to Prentice tomorrow, he said. I'll write out what you need to ask for, she said. The specific terms. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, she said, already reaching for the paper. Prentice conversation went better than Elias had prepared for, and worse than they'd hoped, which was the usual shape of such things. Old Prentice was a man who'd been on that land longer than most of the county had existed, and he had the specific stubbornness of someone who has survived by refusing to move. He wasn't interested in selling anything to Voss. He made that clear with the kind of profanity that Elias had to slightly edit when he reported the conversation to Eliza. But he wasn't much interested in selling the easement either, because it required paperwork and lawyers and men coming onto his land with equipment, and all of that was an irritant he'd spent his life avoiding. What he was interested in was the fact that his fencing on the western edge had been falling down for 2 years, and he didn't have anyone to fix it. Elias came back with this information, and Eliza looked at the ceiling briefly. Fix his fence, she said. 3 days of work, maybe 4. And in exchange, he signs the easement for the creek access. He's willing to consider it. Then we fix his fence, she said. Elias went quiet for a moment. That's 4 days I should be putting into the spring preparation. Yes, she said, but Voss is moving faster than spring preparation. And a water dispute will cost you more than 4 days of work. She looked at him steadily. This is the problem right in front of you. He was quiet another moment. Jonah could help, he said. He's been asking for more to do. Then take him, she said. He needs to see how these things work, how you solve a problem before it becomes a crisis. Elias looked at her. You mean like you do? I mean like anyone should, she said. He took Jonah. They were gone 4 days, and they came back with a signed easement document, and Jonah with the particular expression of a boy who has done real work alongside his father and discovered that his father is someone he can learn from, which was an expression Eliza suspected Jonah had not been able to access for a long time. She filed the easement document in the ledger, behind the loan agreement, where important papers lived. Voss finalized his purchase of the rest of Prentice's land 2 weeks later. When he discovered the Creek Corner easement was already filed, she heard about it secondhand, through the station master again. She heard that he had not reacted well, and she thought about that for a moment with a satisfaction she kept private. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday in late February. It appeared, as cracks often do, not where the pressure was greatest, but where the structure was most worn. And the worn place was not Elias, and not the finances, and not even Voss's maneuvering. It was Eliza herself. She woke up that Tuesday with the specific heaviness that comes from a question you've been refusing to ask yourself, and that has decided to stop waiting. She lay in the small room, the storage room that had become her room, that had a mirror now, and her 2 dresses on a peg, and Samuel's carved horse on the windowsill, because he'd given it to her and she hadn't given it back, and she looked at the ceiling and let the question surface. What was she here? She was useful. She had established that comprehensively. She kept the books. She managed the pantry. She worked with the children. She helped make decisions that affected the ranch's future. She and Elias had a warmth between them that had developed from nothing, from active hostility and frozen distance, into something she did not have a clean word for. He left her coffee. She fixed his coat buttons. They sat across from each other in the evenings with the ledger, or without it, and the conversation they had about the ranch, about the children, about things that had nothing to do with either, had the ease of 2 people whose thinking had learned to accommodate each other. But She was not his wife, not legally, not formally. He'd asked her to stay as his wife, and she'd said yes, and they'd both proceeded as though the agreement were binding, but it was not binding in any way that the world outside this kitchen would recognize. She was a woman living in a man's house, unmarried, without a clear legal standing in relation to the property or the children or anything that mattered. This had been fine when she was surviving week to week, getting through one crisis after the next. It was less fine when she lay on a Tuesday morning and thought about what happened if something went wrong, if Elias got hurt, if Voss found another legal angle, if any of the 100 things that could go wrong in a frontier ranch life went wrong. She had a loan agreement in the ledger, signed and witnessed. She did not have anything else. She got up and made breakfast and said nothing about any of this. She said nothing about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, Willa said something that had nothing to do with it and everything to do with it, the way Willa's observations tended to work. They were making bread together, or Willa was making it, and Eliza was correcting her technique at intervals. Bread was competent but dense because she was impatient with the second rise and always cut it short. Eliza had mentioned this 3 times before, and Willa had nodded and then done it again, because impatience was one of Willa's structural features and not easily modified. "Can I ask you something?" Willa said. "Yes," Eliza said. "Are you happy here?" Eliza looked at her. "Not are you fine," Willa said. "Not are you managing? Are you happy?" It was the question she'd been not asking herself for 4 days, and it arrived from a 15-year-old with the directness of a scalpel. "I'm working on it," Eliza said. Willa punched the bread down for the second rise and covered it with a cloth. "That's not the same as yes." "No," Eliza said, "it's not." Willa was quiet for a moment. Then what would make it yes? Eliza looked at the covered bread dough and thought about how to answer that honestly without burdening this kind, who had already been carrying too much for too long. "Certainty," she said finally. "I've never been very good at the uncertain parts." Willa turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her with the old young eyes that Eliza had noticed from the first moment on the platform. "My father isn't going to say it first," Willa said. "He doesn't say things first. He waits until he's the last option, and then he says it wrong." Eliza looked at her. "You might have to help him," Willa said. "It shouldn't work that way," Eliza said. "No," Willa agreed. "A lot of things shouldn't work the way they work." The conversation she'd been not having with Elias happened 3 evenings later, not because she planned it, but because the choosing moment appeared and she recognized it. They were in the kitchen after the children were in bed. The ledger was on the table, but neither of them was looking at it. Conversation had wound through the week's work and the spring cattle plans, and a problem with the north fence that would need addressing, and then it had gone quiet in the specific way of conversations that have said everything they were officially about and are now in the territory of what they were actually about. Eliza said, "We need to talk about the arrangement." Elias looked up from his coffee. "The arrangement," he said carefully. "You asked me to stay as your wife," she said. "I said yes. But we haven't," she stopped. "Organized. There's nothing formal. No date, no plan. I've been here 2 months and I sleep in the storage room, and I keep your books, and I'm not your wife or your employee. And I have no legal standing in relation to this property or these children." It was very still. "The children I care about enormously," she said, keeping her voice level. "This property I've put my money into, my savings. If something happened to you tomorrow, Willa and I would both be in a very difficult situation." "Nothing is going to." "You don't know that," she said. "Ranching is dangerous, and you know that better than I do." He looked at his hands on the table. "I haven't pushed this," she said, "because I understood you needed time after the ticket and after everything. But I need to know where we are, not what you feel, what you're going to do." The difference between those 2 things sat between them. "I want to marry you." Simply, directly, without the circling of previous attempts. "When?" she said. "Spring," he said, "when the worst of the weather is through. I'd like the children to see it happen properly." He paused. "That's acceptable." She looked at him for a moment. "Acceptable," she said. He nodded. Something in him had settled a shift in the set of his shoulders that she'd learned to read. "And in the meantime," she said, "I'd like a room that's mine. Not the storage room." He blinked. "Then there's the room at the end of the hall that I've been using for nothing." "I know," she said. "I've been past it." "It needs work," he said. "I know how to work," she said. Something moved through his face, half caught between the remnant of his old stubbornness and something that looked helplessly like fondness. "I'll clear it out Saturday," he said. "We'll clear it out Saturday," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. She moved into the proper room the following week, and the symbolic weight of this was not lost on any of the children, though they processed it differently. Mabel told her it had better light than the old room, and she was right. Henry asked if he could see inside it, came in. conducted a complete inspection lasting approximately 90 seconds, and declared it satisfactory. Samuel brought her the wooden horse again, the one she'd wired back together, and placed it on her new windowsill with great ceremony and no explanation. Jonah said nothing, but he found her in the kitchen the evening of the move and said, gruffly, "There's a loose board in the floor in that room. Third one from the window. I can fix it if you want." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He came by the next afternoon with tools and fixed it. He was the most like his father of all the children in the doing, rather than the saying, in the way the action was the language. It was in early March that everything that had been quietly building finally broke open. It broke open in the way these things do not at a dramatic moment, not at the point of highest tension, but at an ordinary one, when the pressure had built long enough that even an ordinary moment couldn't hold it. Elias had gone to town on a Thursday for supplies and ranch business and had come back in the evening with a quietness that was different from his usual quietness. Eliza noted it during supper but said nothing, because she understood that some things needed room to develop before being addressed. The children were louder than usual at supper. Mabel and Henry had gotten into a debate about whether a particular bird Henry had spotted was the species Henry claimed it was, a debate that consumed most of the meal, and Elias sat through it with the familiar patience of a man who has long accepted that his dinner table is not a quiet place. After supper, after the children dispersed, after the dishes were done, he said to her, "Voss was in Rawlins today. Put down the cloth she was using. He had a lawyer with him," Elias said. "From Cheyenne. Hendricks, I know the name. He does mining law mostly, but he takes other cases. What did they want? I heard it secondhand. They were at the bank." He paused. "They were looking at the survey records for the valley." She thought about that. "He's looking for a boundary dispute," she said. "Or a claim overlap. Something he can use to challenge the legal description of your property." "That's what I think. How are your deed documents?" "They're in the house," he said. "The original land grant and the 3 subsequent filings." "I need to look at them," she said. "Tonight?" "Yes," she said. They sat at the kitchen table until midnight again, this time with the deed documents spread between them. Eliza going through each one with the careful attention of someone looking for anything that could be used as a lever. Found 2 things: a boundary description in the original grant that used a geographic marker, a specific rock formation on the south ridge that had never been formalized in a surveyor's report, and a gap in one of the subsequent filings that should have referenced the prior document and didn't. Neither of these was a fatal flaw, but both of them were the kind of thing a determined lawyer could introduce uncertainty around. "You need a surveyor," she said, "to formally document the boundary markers. Before Voss's lawyer does it first and finds different measurements. Surveyors I know what they cost," she said, "and I know what a boundary dispute costs. This is cheaper." He looked at the documents. His jaw had the familiar set of a man doing math he doesn't like. "I'll send for one," he said, "from Rawlins." "Send to Cheyenne," she said. "The Rawlins surveyor does work for Voss. I saw his name in the land records at the bank when we were sorting out the easement." Elias stared at her. "I look at things," she said. "I always have." He was quiet a moment. Then, with a weight she hadn't heard in his voice in weeks, "I'm tired of this. Of him. Of watching my own land like it's something he can just..." He stopped. His hand pressed flat on the table. "Clara and I built this from nothing. We broke this ground. We ran that first herd in weather that would have turned a smarter person around." He looked at the documents. "Belongs to my children. Not..." He stopped himself. Eliza looked at him. This was the most she'd heard him say about Clara, and the history of the place in a single breath, and she understood that it was grief and fury combined, specific combination that surfaces when you're being forced to fight for something you've already paid for in ways money can't measure. "We'll protect it," she said, quietly, firmly. The way she said things she meant completely. "That's what we're going to do." He looked at her. She held the look. Something in him, the part that was still reflexively alone, still trained by 2 years of solitary weight-bearing, moved and then settled, the way a door settles into its frame when someone finally gets the hinge right. "All right," he said. The surveyor came from Cheyenne the following week, and the survey took 3 days, and it found exactly what Eliza had expected it to find. The boundaries were where they had always been, exactly as the original grant described, and the rock formation on the south ridge was precisely where it needed to be. The gap in the subsequent filing was a clerical issue with no legal impact on the property description. All of this was now formally documented, surveyed, signed, and filed in the county recorder's office before Voss's Cheyenne lawyer had a chance to commission his own survey. The morning the filing was confirmed, Elias came back from Rawlins and handed Eliza the receipt, and she put it behind the loan agreement and the easement document and the deed papers in the ledger, which was becoming its own kind of fortress on a shelf. He said, "He's not going to stop." "No," she said. "He's not. But we're further ahead than we were." "Every time," she said. "We stay one step further ahead." He looked at the ledger on the shelf, then at her. "What would I have done?" he said. Not quite a question. More like something he was thinking aloud, which was unusual for him, and she noted it. "You'd have managed," she said. "I'd have lost it," he said. She didn't argue with him, because they both knew he was probably right. What nobody had been expecting, not Eliza, not Elias, not even Willa with all her careful watching, was that the breaking point, when it came, would come from a direction none of them had been watching. It was late March. The worst of the winter had broken, not dramatically, but in the gradual way of mountain winters, the snow still present but receding, the mud emerging, particular quality of the light beginning to change in the morning so that it arrived with a different weight than it had in February. Elias got a letter. It came on a Thursday in the mail that came through with the supply wagon, and Eliza happened to be in the kitchen when he brought it in and opened it. She watched him read it, and she watched the expression on his face change in a way she hadn't seen before, not the tightening of the jaw she knew, not the deliberate stillness, but something older than those, something that reached underneath the things he'd built to keep himself intact. He set the letter on the table. She waited. "It's from Clara's sister," he said. "In Missouri, she wants the children." The kitchen went very still. She heard that I was planning to remarry. She says he stopped, picked up the letter. "Read from it directly. Given the circumstances, I believe it is in the children's best interest to be raised in a stable Christian home, and I am prepared to petition the court for guardianship of all 5 children if necessary." He set it down again. Eliza said carefully, "How much contact have the children had with her?" 2 visits, he said, both before Clara died. She and Clara weren't close. Different, they disagreed about things. He stopped. She never visited after the funeral. She sent a letter saying she would when she could. She didn't, and now she wants guardianship. She wants leverage, he said flatly. Voss does. He knows enough people in enough places. He looked at Eliza. "I don't know that he's behind this. I can't prove it." "No," she said. "But the timing is notable." His hands were flat on the table, pressed down, the way he held himself together when something was threatening to come apart. "They're not taking my children," he said. It was said quietly and entirely without theater, which made it more absolute than any louder statement would have been. "No," Eliza said. "They're not." She pulled the letter across the table and read it herself, the full text. It was written in careful legal-adjacent language, not formally legal, but shaped by someone who'd either had legal advice or was good at imitating it. The reference to petition the court was specific and deliberate. "You need to marry me sooner than spring," she said. He looked up. "A married household is harder to challenge than an unmarried one," she said. "Changes the legal picture. Not completely, she may still try, but it closes the easiest avenue." She kept her voice practical and clear, because this was not the moment for anything except clarity. "I'm not saying this should be why we do it. It's not why we're doing it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason to move the when." He looked at her for a long moment. "How soon?" he said. "How soon can the circuit judge be in Rawlins?" He knew the schedule. 2 weeks, he said. Then 2 weeks, she said. He nodded once. And she saw it cost him something, not the decision itself, but the way the decision had been forced, the way Voss, or whoever was behind this, had managed to make even this good thing feel like a maneuver. She saw that clearly and understood it, and she wished she could change it, and she couldn't. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "It's still real," she said. "What we're doing, it's still ours. Nothing he does changes that part." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he got up and went to the door and took his coat from the peg, the coat with no ticket in it now, nothing in it but the ordinary contents of a man's coat, and he went outside, because he needed air, because he was a man who processed things in motion. She let him go. She picked up the letter again and read it a second time, more slowly, looking for every specific word choice that might matter. And when she'd finished, she folded it and put it in the ledger behind everything else. She sat for a moment in the kitchen that she had been slowly turning from a survival space into something that felt like a home, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they were up against. Then she got up and started on supper because the children would be in from school and they would be hungry, and that was something she could do. She did not tell the children about the letter that evening. But children live in the same house as their parents' silences, and they read those silences the way experienced travelers read weather, not always accurately, but rarely entirely wrong. Willa noticed that her father came in from outside with something held behind his face. Henry noticed that Eliza was quieter than usual, and compensated by being louder, which was Henry's instinctive response to any perceived atmospheric pressure. Mabel stayed close to Eliza in the kitchen, in the specific way of a child who knows something is wrong and has decided that proximity is the best available response. Jonah noticed and said nothing, and went to his room after supper and stayed there. Samuel fell asleep at the table again, his cheek on his folded arms, his dark lashes still against his face, utterly undone by the demands of being 4 years old in a world that kept producing new things to pay attention to. Elias picked him up and carried him to bed, and Eliza watched from the hallway doorway this big, careful man carrying his smallest child with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and she thought, this is what we're protecting. Not the land, not the water rights, not the survey documents in the ledger. This, 2 days later, Elias told the children. He told them at breakfast, which was unusual morning, was not a time for serious conversations in this house. It was a time for the logistics of the day, and Henry's questions, and getting everyone out the door. But Elias sat them all down with their porridge and told them plainly, the way he always did the necessary things. There was a letter from their Aunt Ruth in Missouri. She was suggesting that the children might do better in her care. They were not going, and that was not going to happen, and he wanted them to hear it from him directly. The table was very quiet when he finished. Then Mabel said, I don't know Aunt Ruth. You met her twice, Willa said. I was little, Mabel said. She smelled like lavender, and she didn't let me touch her things. Henry said, she can't actually make us go, can she? No, Elias said, clearly without hesitation. How do you know? Henry said. Not challenging, Henry never challenged, he inquired. Because we're going to make sure of it, Elias said. He glanced at Eliza. Henry followed his gaze, then looked back at his father. Is that what Miss Whitmore is for? Henry, Wilsa said in her quelling voice. Henry clarified hastily. Is that why she's staying? To help with things like this? She's staying because I asked her to, Elias said. And because she agreed. And in 2 weeks we're going to be married, which I was going to tell you at a better moment than this. But, he looked at the 5 faces around the table. There it is. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one before it. Mabel started crying, which startled everyone, including Mabel, who looked surprised at herself. Good crying, she clarified quickly through the tears. I'm not sad, Henry said very seriously. Then she'll actually plant the sunflowers. Samuel looked at Eliza and held up his carved wooden horse, for no clear reason except that it seemed like the right contribution to the moment. Jonah didn't say anything. He looked at the table. His jaw was working in the way of someone managing something they're not ready to name. Then he looked at Eliza directly, for longer than he'd ever looked at her before. She's not replacing Mama, he said. His voice was careful and a little rough. No one is replacing anyone, Elias said. Jonah looked at Eliza. She met his eyes and held them. I know, she said. Just that. He held her gaze another moment. Then he nodded once with a precision that meant something. A door opened. Not all the way and not without weight behind it, but open. Willa, through all of this, had not said a word. She sat at the end of the table with her hands around her porridge bowl and her face doing the complicated work it always did when something mattered to her, which was to show very little and mean a great deal. She looked at her father. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he confirmed. She looked at Eliza, and what passed between them in that look was too layered to say simply, the recognition of 2 people who have been in the same fight from different sides, and have arrived at the same place by very different roads, and who understand each other in a specific way that has nothing to do with the usual things people understand each other through. Willa said, You'd better not let him be an idiot about this. I'll do my best, Eliza said. Mabel laughed through her tears. Henry beamed. Samuel put the carved horse down next to Eliza's porridge bowl with great ceremony. Elias looked at the ceiling briefly, in the manner of a man who has accepted that he has lost control of his own household, and is, on balance, not entirely displeased about it. It was the closest thing to a family agreement they had made. It was not formal, and it was not perfect, and it was signed by no one. But it was real, in the way that the things you can't put in a ledger are always the most real things. The 2 weeks moved the way important time always moves too slowly in the middle and too fast at the edges, so that when the morning of the circuit judge's visit arrived, Eliza found herself standing in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, thinking that she had not fully prepared for this, which was an unusual thought for a woman who prepared for everything. She was not unprepared in any practical sense. The documents were in order. Elias had arranged for 2 neighbors to stand as witnesses, the aldermans from the next spread, who had been watching the developments at the Rourke Ranch with the quiet approval of people who understand what it takes to hold a frontier property together. Mabel had been asking for 3 days whether she could wear her good dress, and had been told yes. and had since asked 4 more times to confirm. Henry had prepared what he described as a short speech, which Eliza suspected would be neither short nor a speech in any conventional sense. She was not unprepared. She was simply standing in her kitchen at 5 in the morning understanding, with the particular clarity of very early mornings, exactly what was about to happen. She was going to marry a man she had come 900 miles to meet and had nearly left twice, and had stayed for reasons that had started as practical and become something that didn't have a clean word. She was going to become the legal stepmother of 5 children, the oldest of whom had forged her father's name on 112 pages of correspondence, and the youngest of whom had given her a carved wooden horse as his primary means of emotional expression. She was going to sign her name to a life in Wyoming that bore no resemblance to the life she had been living 3 months ago. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that train. 1 suitcase, $43, a one-way ticket she'd already used, which made it irrelevant. That woman had been braver than she knew, or more desperate. Sometimes those looked the same from the inside. She put the coffee on. Elias came downstairs earlier than usual, which told her he hadn't slept well either. Came into the kitchen and saw her at the stove and stopped for a moment in the doorway, taking in the scene, the early light, the coffee, the woman who was going to be his wife in approximately 4 hours standing at his stove. In the ordinary way, she always stood at his stove, as if she'd always been there. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she said. He came in and poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, which was a new posture. He'd started doing that, leaning against the counter in the mornings, closer to where she worked rather than sitting at the table. She'd noticed and not said anything. "Any particular reason?" he said. "Thinking," she said. "About?" She considered how to say it. "About the woman I was when I got off that train," she said. "I've been trying to figure out if I'd do it again." He was quiet a moment. "Would you?" "Yes," she said. "But I wish I'd known what I was walking into." "What would you have done differently?" Thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything seriously. "I'd have brought more practical clothing," she said. "Coat I arrived in was completely wrong for Wyoming." He looked at her. Then something in his face gave way, not quite a laugh, but the release that comes before one, the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully and has decided he doesn't need to hold it that carefully anymore. "I'll buy you a better coat," he said. "I've already ordered one," she said. "From the catalog. It comes next month." He looked at her with that expression. She'd stopped trying to name the one that was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer than he usually let show. "Of course you have," he said. The children woke in stages, as they always did. Samuel first, padding into the kitchen in his nightshirt, with his hair flattened on one side and his eyes still half closed, climbing into the chair nearest Eliza without checking whether she was there, because he'd stopped checking. Some weeks ago she was there. She was always there. His small body had apparently decided this was a fact of the world and adjusted accordingly. Mabel came down already in her good dress, which she'd clearly put on the moment she woke up, and which had a wrinkle across the front from where she'd slept in it, which she hadn't. Henry came down with the written speech in his hand, already reading it under his breath. Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the assembled family, and came in and sat down without comment, which for Jonah was the equivalent of a warm welcome. Willa came last. She stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, her father with his coffee, Eliza at the stove, the younger children arranged around the table in their various stages of mourning, and her face did the complicated thing it always did, showing very little and meaning a great deal. Then she came in and took her usual chair and said, "The alderman's wagon just passed the North Ridge. They'll be here in an hour. Then everyone needs to be ready in 40 minutes, Eliza said. "I'm ready," Mabel said, gesturing at the dress. "Your hair isn't," Willa said. "I was going to ask Eliza after breakfast," Eliza said. "Eat first." This was how the morning of her wedding began, with practical negotiations about breakfast and hair, and the alderman's wagon and Henry's speech, which he read one section of aloud to test the reaction, and which provoked a debate between himself and Mabel about whether falcons were actually relevant to the occasion. It was chaotic and specific, and nothing like what weddings looked like in her imagination, which had always involved a certain composed dignity that the reality of this kitchen made impossible. Found that she didn't mind. The circuit judge was a man named Calloway, compact and businesslike, with the efficient manner of someone who performed many such ceremonies in many such kitchens, and had developed a pace that respected everyone's time. He arrived with the aldermans, shook hands with Elias, introduced himself to Eliza with a brief, direct assessment that seemed to reach some conclusion he didn't share, and asked if everyone was ready. "We're ready, more or less." Henry's speech turned out to be not a speech but a series of facts about partnership in the natural world, including one extended section about prairie dogs that Eliza suspected was only loosely connected to the occasion, but which he delivered with great conviction, and which Mabel actually seemed to find interesting. Judge Calloway waded through it with the patient expression of a man who has heard stranger things in frontier kitchens. The ceremony itself was short. It was meant to be short. Neither Elias nor Eliza had asked for anything elaborate, and Judge Calloway had read the room accurately. There were words said, questions asked, answers given. Eliza said "I do" in the same voice she used for everything that mattered, which was clear and level, the voice of a woman who means what she says and knows it. Elias said it differently, with a slight pause before it, a breath held and then released, the way a man says a thing he's been careful about and is choosing, finally, to stop being careful about. She heard everything in that pause, and she held it, and she did not make him self-conscious about it. He put a ring on her finger. It had been Clara's. She knew, and she had known it would be. There was no other ring. He was not a wealthy man, and more than that, she understood what it meant that he'd decided it was all right to let Clara's ring be part of this. She understood it as the particular kind of honoring that doesn't require forgetting, and she received it in that spirit. When it was done, Mabel cried again. Henry shook Judge Calloway's hand and gave him a summary of the Falcon section of the speech, in case he'd missed the relevance. Samuel, who had stood through the whole ceremony with his carved horse in one hand, handed it to Eliza again, which appeared to be his formal ratification of the proceedings. Jonah, standing at the edge of the group, caught her eye when she turned. He gave her one nod, the same nod he'd given her the day she'd said "I know" when he'd said she wasn't replacing his mother. Precise, deliberate, containing more than it showed. She gave him one back. Willa was the last. After the aldermans had shaken hands and Judge Calloway had taken his fee and been given coffee and cornbread for the road, after the younger children had dispersed into the bright March morning, in the way of children released from formality, Willa found her near the porch. She didn't say anything for a moment. They stood side by side, looking out at the yard, where Henry was already explaining something to Mr. Alderman's horse, and where Mabel had found a patch of ground that had gone soft in the morning sun and was investigating it in her good dress to Willa's visible concern. "I didn't know if it would work," Willa said finally. Her voice was quiet, the way she went quiet when she was saying something that cost her. "When I wrote the letters," Willa said, "I knew it was wrong. I knew I was lying, but I also," and she stopped, "I knew if someone didn't do something, we were going to lose everything. The ranch, the family papa would have just," she shook her head, "disappearing. A little more every month. I could see it and I couldn't stop it." "I know," Eliza said. "I didn't know who you'd be," Willa said. "I just knew we needed someone." She paused. "I was lucky." Eliza turned and looked at her. This girl, this 15-year-old, who had carried a family on her back, with letters and lamplight and borrowed words, who had held it together with the sheer force of refusing to let it fall, who had been braver and more desperate and more resourceful than most adults Eliza had ever known. "So was I," Eliza said. Willa looked at her. Something in her face shifted something she'd been holding since the platform, since the first letter, since the night she lit the lamp and wrote "Dear Miss Whitmore" in her father's careful hand. Didn't fully release. Probably some of it would never fully release. But it moved like a window opening in a room that had been shut too long. She didn't hug Eliza. She wasn't that kind of girl, not yet. But she stood beside her on the porch for a long time, in the thin March sunlight, and that was its own kind of thing. The letter from Clara's sister Ruth was answered by their lawyer in Rawlins. Eliza had found the lawyer, a meticulous woman named Doris Crane, who took frontier property and family cases, and who had read Ruth's letter with the expression of someone who has read many such letters and knows exactly what they are. Mrs. Crane wrote back in the clean, specific language of someone who is very good at her work, laying out the current legal standing of the Rourke household, married parents, stable property, documented finances, 5 children whose welfare and schooling were being actively maintained. The letter invited Ruth to pursue her guardianship petition if she believed she had grounds, and reminded her of the costs, financial and otherwise, of such proceedings. Ruth did not respond. They heard, through the indirect channels that carried all frontier news, that she had written to Voss sometime in late April. They heard this because a ranch hand who'd worked for Voss told a man at the feed store who told the station master who told Elias. The nature of what she'd written was not known, but the timing coincided with Voss going quiet for a stretch, and Eliza had learned enough about the man's methods to understand what quiet from Voss usually meant. It meant recalculation. She wrote everything down. Dates, sources, the indirect chain of information. She put it in the ledger. If Voss was recalculating, she would be prepared for whatever he calculated toward. Spring moved forward, and nothing came. Calves came in April, 31 of them, which was a good number, not the number Elias had hoped for in his most optimistic projection, but close. The births went the way ranch births go, mostly without incident, and occasionally with the kind of incident that requires someone standing in freezing mud at 3 in the morning making difficult decisions. Elias came in those mornings, looking like a man who has been through something, and Eliza had coffee ready and said little, and he drank the coffee and went back out, and this rhythm had its own kind of intimacy. Jonah worked alongside his father through the calving, doing it properly now not as a chore but as an education, learning the livestock the way his father knew it, which was from the ground up, from the particular behavioral signs that tell you what an animal needs before it becomes urgent. Elias taught him the way he did most things, through doing rather than explaining, and Jonah absorbed it in the same way. She watched this and felt something that wasn't quite pride, because they weren't hers to be proud of in any conventional sense. It was more like satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of a structure functioning the way it was meant to, of pieces that had been misaligned, fitting together and holding. Henry planted his sunflowers in mid-April, on the south side of the barn, exactly as he'd planned on that first wagon ride. Planted them with the serious focus he brought to anything that interested him, measuring the spacing between seeds with a stick he'd calibrated for the purpose, explaining to anyone within earshot the optimal soil temperature for germination. Eliza helped him, when he asked, by watering the patch in the early mornings so that he could check on it when he came home from school. He checked on it every day. He stood over the bare patch of ground and examined it with the attention of someone waiting for evidence that the world works the way he's been told it works. The first green showed in early May. He came to find her immediately, at a pace that was technically not running because he'd been told not to run in the house, but which was indistinguishable from running to anyone observing. "Coming up," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw this morning." He looked slightly disappointed at not being the first informant, then rallied. "There are 6 of them," I counted. "There will be more," she said. "Give them time." "How long?" "Patient people see the most sunflowers," she said. He considered this with the expression of someone who has identified a logical gap. "That's not scientifically, Henry," she said. "Yes?" "Go check again tomorrow," he went. The first real proof that Voss had changed his approach came in June, not as a threat but as an absence of one. Elias heard through the reliable informal network that Voss had turned his primary attention to a land consolidation further north in the territory, larger parcels, less complicated by legal obstacles, easier acquisition. The Rourke property, with its surveyed and filed boundaries, its easement on the creek access, its documented finances and stable household, had apparently become the problem that wasn't worth the effort. Voss was a businessman ultimately, and businessmen move toward the path of least resistance when the resistance becomes too organized and too consistent to make the effort worth the return. Elias told her this on an evening in June, sitting on the repaired porch with the last of the daylight going gold across the east field and the cattle moving as dark shapes against it. She sat with this information for a moment. "You don't quite believe it," he said, reading her. "I believe it," she said. "I just know he might come back." "He might," Elias said, "but we'll be ready. We'll be ready," she agreed. They sat in the evening quiet. From inside the house, she could hear Mabel's voice and then Willa's, and the particular sound of a Mabel-Willa debate, which had a distinctive rhythm she'd come to know. Mabel passionate and a little scattered, Willa systematic and occasionally dry, both of them actually listening to the other, even when it didn't look like it. Henry's voice from upstairs reading aloud to no one in particular, which was a habit he'd developed that no one had discouraged because it seemed to make him happy. And below all of it, from somewhere in the house, the sound of Samuel, asleep. Samuel had stopped waking in the night. Not all at once, it had happened gradually. Fewer nights, then rare nights, then none. She didn't know exactly what had changed. She suspected it was a combination of things. The house itself feeling different, the new steadiness that had settled in through months of accumulated ordinary days. Whatever the cause, Samuel slept through the night now deeply, without the terror that had been sending him down the hall to scratch at Willa's door in the dark. Willa had mentioned it to Eliza in April. In passing, the way she mentioned significant things that she didn't want to make too significant. "He slept all night again," she'd said. "That's 14 days in a row." Eliza had said, "I know. That started around January," Willa had said. Not looking at her when you started. Eliza hadn't answered that. Thought about it afterward, though. The idea that a 4-year-old child's nightmares had something to do with her presence was not something she could claim any credit for. She'd simply been there consistently, and apparently that was what was needed. The simplest things sometimes are. Mabel's baking had by summer developed into something genuine. Not professional, she was 9, and she measured wrong sometimes, and she had a tendency to add extra sugar on the theory that more was better, which was not universally true but produced memorable results. But she baked with pleasure now rather than with the grim competence she'd brought to kitchen tasks before, and there was a difference in the outcome that was hard to quantify and easy to taste. She made cornbread for the hands during the summer cattle work, and it disappeared fast enough that she started making 2 batches, and the second batch disappeared just as fast. And she came to Eliza with the expression of someone who has discovered something about themselves. They actually like it, she said. Yes, Eliza said. Not just because they're hungry. No, Eliza said. Because it's good. Mabel thought about this. Is that what it feels like? When you do something and it's actually good? Pretty much, Eliza said. Mabel went back to the kitchen and made a 3rd batch. What Eliza thought about, in the evenings that summer, sitting with Elias on the repaired porch, while the light came down off the ridges in the long way of June and July, was the question of belonging. She'd spent 31 years being useful. She'd kept books and mended things and managed other people's problems with a competence that was genuine but had always felt slightly external to her, like a skill she'd developed rather than a quality she'd grown into. She'd been good at solving problems that weren't hers. She'd been less clear on what it meant to have a problem that was hers to solve a life that was hers to inhabit rather than manage. She thought she understood it now. Not completely, not without the edges and complications that everything real carries with it, but enough. Belonging wasn't the thing she'd imagined in Ohio, sitting with 1 lamp and 4 months of letters, and the image she'd built from someone else's words. It wasn't the finished version of a thing. It was the ongoing work of a thing, the daily decisions to stay, to repair, to face what needed facing, and then come back to the table and eat supper and do it again the next day. It was choosing, again and again, without the comfort of certainty, because certainty was not something frontier life offered, and you learned to stop expecting it. It was Eliza saying, "What do you think about the cattle rotation?" and meaning it. It was Willa setting down, incrementally, the weight of the household she'd been carrying since she was 13. It was Jonah choosing to walk through the front door after school and sit in the kitchen instead of going to his room. It was Mabel's extra sugar and Henry's methodical sunflowers and Samuel's carved horse, placed on her windowsill each morning by a small hand that had decided, without deliberation, that this was where it belonged. It was the ledger on the shelf, full now with the accumulated evidence of a life being managed together, the loan agreement and the easement and the survey documents and the lawyer's letter, and all the small records of all the decisions that had been made in that kitchen, at that table, by 2 people who had not planned to be here and had stayed anyway. She thought, this is what I came for. Not what I thought I was coming for, but this. The summer afternoon she thought about most afterward was a Tuesday in July. Nothing particular happened. That was the point of it. Elias was in the East Field. Willa was at the alderman's helping with their mending, which she'd started doing for a small wage because she'd decided she wanted her own money, and Eliza had supported this idea completely. Jonah was with his father. Henry was in the barn with a book about geology he'd borrowed from the school, and a rock sample he'd found that he was determined to identify. Mabel was in the kitchen, making something that involved more flour than was strictly necessary for whatever she was attempting. Samuel found Eliza sitting on the porch steps, going through the week's accounts, and climbed into her lap without asking, and put his thumb in his mouth and looked out at the yard with the complete contentment of a child who is exactly where he wants to be. She moved the accounts to one side so he had room. She put one hand on his back lightly, the way Elias did the reflexive gesture of someone who has done something often enough that it stopped being a gesture. They sat like that in the July afternoon. This woman who had come 900 miles, and this small boy who had never been anywhere, while Henry's voice floated out of the barn asking questions. Nobody was there to answer, and the smell of Mabel's questionable baking project drifted from the kitchen window, and the cattle stood in the far field in the good summer light. She thought about the woman on that platform, the frozen wind, the one suitcase, the man who wouldn't look at her, and the girl who walked over and said what she needed to say, even though it cost her. She thought, look where you are now, not in a triumphant way. In the quiet way of someone who has been allowed to arrive somewhere they weren't certain they would reach, and who is trying to properly acknowledge it before the moment passes. She had arrived as a stranger and had stayed until staying was no longer a decision and had become simply the shape of her life. She had fixed a window pane and kept books and made biscuits and read a loan agreement by lamplight and replaced a button on a coat and found a ticket in a pocket and let a man burn it without making him explain himself further. She had learned which floorboard creaked and where the roof needed work, and which child needed silence and which needed questions answered, and which needed only to know that someone was in the next room. She had learned, most importantly, that love in its actual form is not the thing letters describe. The letters were not wrong. Exactly, they had told her something true. But the truth they'd told was incomplete, the way all the true things you know before you've lived something are incomplete. The real thing was harder and more specific and considerably less composed than the version in correspondence, and it was also more real than anything she'd held in her hands before, including $43 and a one-way ticket. The sunflowers opened in late July, 14 of them in a long bright row on the south side of the barn. Henry stood in front of them on the morning they opened and looked at them for a long time. Eliza came to stand beside him with her coffee. 14, he said. I see that, she said. I planted 8, he said. 14 came up. Seeds do that sometimes, she said. He was quiet for a moment, processing. I was patient, he said. You were, she said. He nodded, satisfied, as though this confirmed something he'd been conducting an informal experiment on. Then he went to school. Eliza stood looking at the sunflowers after he'd gone. 14 of them, bright and specific and facing the morning in the way of things that grow toward light, because it's the only direction that makes sense. This is what I would tell you, if you were listening. Not every desperate act earns the thing it reaches for. Not every 900-mile journey ends in the place you were trying to go. Life on the frontier, life, anywhere, if you're paying attention, does not offer guarantees, and the people who wait for guarantees before they move are the people who don't move at all. Willa wrote those letters out of desperation and love, and the particular courage of someone who has run out of every option except the unlikely one. She was wrong to lie. She was right to act. Both of those things are true at the same time and always will be. Elias held a ticket in his pocket for weeks, because love, the second time, feels like standing at the edge of something and not being able to see the bottom. He had lost too much to step off casually, but he stepped off. That matters. Not the ticket, the burning of it. And Eliza, who had spent 31 years being useful in ways nobody saw clearly, who had saved her money dollar by dollar toward a life she couldn't yet name, who had sat in a dress shop in Ohio and decided that a 4-line advertisement was worth 900 miles of winter, she had not been wrong. She had been early. The life was here. It had been here, needing someone to see it clearly enough to stay. There is something worth saying about the people who stay, not the ones who stay because leaving is too hard, or because they have no options. The ones who stay when leaving is entirely possible, when the stage is running and the ticket could be arranged, and the door is not locked. The ones who look at the broken thing, the house with rags in the windows, the family held together by a 15-year-old's forgery, the man who couldn't look at you when you arrived and decide that broken is not the same as lost. Those people are rarer than the stories make them sound. And they are not saints. Eliza was not a saint. She was a woman with $43 in savings and strong opinions about accounting, and a tendency to fix things that weren't her problem because she had not yet fully learned the difference between what was hers and what wasn't. And as it turned out, that was exactly the right flaw to bring to Wyoming in the winter of 1883. She turned from the sunflowers and went back to the house where Mabel was already in the kitchen, and the coffee was on, and Elias was coming in from the morning check with mud on his boots and something to say about the fence line. And the ledger sat on its shelf, full of the evidence of a life that had decided, against considerable odds, to hold. She had come with one suitcase and no guarantee. She had stayed until this was home. And the home they had built together with letters and ledgers and wrong measurements corrected and tickets burned and fences fixed and sunflowers that produced more than anyone planted became the kind of place that holds against the weather. Not because it was perfect, because it was theirs.